She didn't ask for permission. She didn't lower her eyes or soften her voice. When Lord Harwick read those numbers aloud, with the confidence of a man who had never once been wrong, Amelia Whitmore set down her fork, looked him directly in the face and said, "Those figures are incorrect. Your estate has lost nearly £4,000 this year, and if you continue at this rate, you'll have nothing left to pass to your sons." The room stopped breathing. Every eye turned to her, and not a single person came to her defense. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Amelia's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. The silence that followed Amelia's words was not the polite momentary kind that fills a room when someone spills their wine. It was the deep, suffocating silence of a gathering that has just witnessed something it does not know how to process. 23 people seated around that long mahogany table, and not one of them spoke. Not Lord Harwick, whose face had gone from its usual ruddy satisfaction to a shade of white that made him look suddenly ill. Not his wife, who had been mid-sip from her crystal glass and now sat frozen with it still at her lips. Not Amelia's own mother, seated 4 chairs down, whose hand had found the edge of the tablecloth and gripped it like she was bracing for a carriage crash. The candles continued to burn. The fire continued to crackle. And Amelia sat with her spine straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap, because she had not said anything untrue, and she did not intend to apologize for arithmetic. Lord Harwick recovered first. Men like him always did, because men like him had spent their entire lives being told that recovery was their birthright. "I beg your pardon," he said. His voice was very quiet. That was how Amelia knew he was furious. Loud men were rarely the dangerous ones. It was the quiet ones who made you feel the weight of what they could do. "I said your figures are incorrect," Amelia repeated, because she had never seen the point in retreating from a truth simply because someone found it uncomfortable. "You stated that Harwick Manor produced a net surplus of £1,200 last quarter. But I reviewed the county agricultural reports that were published last month, and your yield numbers don't align with what you've declared. If anything, the property has been losing value steadily for the past 3 years, not because the land is poor, because the management of it is." Someone at the far end of the table made a sound. It might have been a gasp. It might have been a laugh quickly swallowed. Amelia did not look to find out. Lord Harwick stood up. Not violently, he was too careful a man for that in public, but slowly, deliberately, the way a man stands up when he wants the room to understand that he is the one who decides when a conversation ends. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I did not ask for your analysis." "No," Amelia agreed. "You didn't. But the people in this room who have invested in your ventures deserve accurate information, and I thought someone ought to provide it." Her father's chair scraped back so fast it nearly toppled. He was on his feet before Amelia had finished her sentence, and the expression on his face was not anger, not exactly, but something worse. The particular terror of a man who can see his social standing crumbling in real time and has no idea how to stop it. "Lord Harwick, please forgive my daughter," he said, and his voice had that forced brightness men use when they're trying to sound light while something is breaking inside them. "She is young, and sometimes speaks before she considers." "I considered every word," Amelia said, not loudly. "Amelia." Her father's voice dropped to a near whisper. "That is enough." She looked at him then. Her father, Edmund Whitmore, a man she had loved her whole life, and watched spend that same whole life performing adequacy for people who would never fully accept him. He had a kind heart. He was not a cruel man. But at that moment, seated at Lord Harwick's table, with his daughter's intelligence burning a hole through 20 years of careful social maneuvering, he looked at her like she was something he could not afford. She picked up her glass. She took a composed sip, and she said nothing more. It was over in under 4 minutes. The dinner resumed. Conversations restarted with the performative enthusiasm of people desperate to pretend nothing had happened. Lord Harwick returned to his seat and spoke only to the gentleman on his left for the remainder of the evening. And Amelia ate her meal in the particular isolation that comes not from being excluded, but from being too clearly seen. She was 24 years old. She had been too clearly seen her entire life. The carriage ride home was silent for nearly a mile. Then her mother spoke. "You understand what you've done." It wasn't a question. Margaret Whitmore had the voice of a woman who had learned long ago that questions gave other people room to defend themselves, and she was not in the mood to give her daughter room. "I corrected a mathematical error," Amelia said. "You humiliated one of the most powerful landowners in the county at his own dinner table." I presented accurate figures, in front of his wife, in front of his business partners, in front of everyone whose good opinion we depend on. Her mother's voice cracked on the last word just slightly, just enough that Amelia heard it and felt the familiar guilt settle in her chest like something heavy. "Amelia, do you have any idea how difficult it has been for your father to secure these invitations, to build these relationships? Lord Harwick's endorsement alone could mean the difference between your brother's career advancing or stalling for another decade. Lord Harwick's estate is going to fail," Amelia said quietly. "If father has invested anything with him, he needs to know that." Silence. Then her father's voice from the opposite corner of the carriage, older and more tired than she'd ever heard it. "You are too clever to stay among respectable people, Amelia. That is the problem. You always have been." She did not respond. There was nothing to say to that. It was the most honest thing her father had ever said to her, and it was meant to wound, and it did, and he knew it, and neither of them acknowledged any of those three things. She looked out the window at the dark road. She thought about these numbers. She thought about the way they sat in her mind, neat and absolute, refusing to be anything other than what they were. She thought about how it felt to look at a ledger and understand it immediately, to see not just the figures, but the story behind them, the decisions and the negligence and the slow creep of collapse that most people called bad luck, because they didn't want to call it what it actually was. She had been doing this since she was 12 years old. Reading her father's accounts when he wasn't watching. Catching errors he'd missed. Quietly correcting them and returning the books to his desk as if nothing had changed. She had never told him. He would not have thanked her for it. She had spent her entire life making herself useful in ways no one wanted to acknowledge. 3 days later, her parents called her into the parlor after breakfast. Her father stood by the window with his hands behind his back, which meant he had already made a decision and was now preparing to present it as if it were reasonable. Her mother sat in the chair beside the fire, which meant she had agreed to the decision and was now present as moral reinforcement. Amelia stood in the doorway and knew before either of them spoke. "We've been thinking," her father began, "about Thornfield." Thornfield, the family's countryside property, 40 miles from the city, 100 acres of farmland and a manor house that hadn't been properly maintained in 6 years. It was not a punishment precisely. It was worse than a punishment. It was a reassignment. The kind you gave to something you didn't know what to do with. "It needs management," her father continued. "The accounts are in disarray. The tenants are unhappy. The property is losing money every quarter, and I don't have the time to attend to it properly, and frankly, I don't have the capital to hire someone competent." He stopped. He looked at her. "You are clearly very good with numbers," he said. And there it was, the compliment shaped like a dismissal. The acknowledgement that had no warmth in it. The recognition that came with conditions. Her mother spoke more gently. "It would only be temporary, until things settle down here, until the situation with Lord Harwick is forgotten." "And how long will that take?" Amelia asked. Her parents exchanged a glance. A very small, very telling glance, the kind that happens between two people who have already discussed how to answer a question they knew was coming. "A season, perhaps," her mother said. "Maybe 2. Amelia understood then. She understood it the way you understand things that you've known for a while but haven't let yourself fully accept. She was not being sent to manage Thornfield. She was being removed. She was being placed somewhere her intelligence would be absorbed by the land itself, invisible and useful, and far away from anyone whose opinion mattered to her family. She could have refused. She was 24, not a child. She had no legal obligation to go where they sent her. But she looked at her father's tired face and her mother's careful hands, and she thought about what refusal would cost them, what it would cost her brother, what it would cost the fragile social architecture they had spent decades building, and she said, "I'll go." Her mother exhaled. Her father nodded quickly like a man who has been holding his breath and needs to move on before the feeling catches up to him. Amelia went back upstairs to her room and sat at her writing desk and did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. She wrote a list instead. Everything she would need. Everything she would need to understand. Everything Thornfield would require of her. She was too clever to break over this. She was too clever to break over anything. That was the problem. She arrived at Thornfield on a gray Tuesday in late March, and the place was exactly as bad as the accounts had suggested, and somehow worse in person. The head tenant, a weathered man named Gideon Marsh, who'd been managing the property on his own in the absence of any real authority, met her at the gate with the expression of a man who had been told help was coming and had received something he wasn't sure counted. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His eyes moved briefly to the modest carriage, to her single trunk, to the fact that she had come without a personal maid, or a companion, or any of the usual accoutrements of a young woman of her station. "We weren't expecting that, as Mr. Whitmore's letter said a representative would be arriving to assess the property." "I am the representative," Amelia said. Gideon Marsh blinked. "Right," he said. And then, with the pragmatic flexibility of a man who has dealt with enough genuine problems that he has no energy left for social ones, "I'll show you the books." The books were a disaster. Not the chaotic disaster of negligence, which would have been forgivable, but the careful, deliberate disaster of a former manager who had been stealing from the estate for years before departing abruptly 18 months ago. The accounts were obscured, not confused, which meant someone had worked hard to make them illegible. It was actually, in a grim way, impressive. Amelia worked through the first night. She sat at the desk in the estate's study with a lamp burning and every ledger open around her, and she worked backward through the numbers, the way you untangle a knot, not by pulling hard, but by following the thread. By morning, she had a clear picture of what had been taken, what remained, and what was theoretically recoverable if she approached it correctly. She also had a headache, no appetite, and a deep private sense of satisfaction that she would not have admitted to anyone. Gideon Marsh knocked on the study door at 7 in the morning and found her still at the desk, surrounded by papers she had reorganized into a system that made no sense to him, but clearly made complete sense to her. "You've been here all night," he said. Not a question, not entirely an accusation, something in between. "I have," she agreed. "Sit down, Mr. Marsh. I want to walk through what I've found." He sat. I was not a man who was accustomed to being directed by a woman half his age, but something in her voice, not the authority exactly, but the complete absence of any anxiety about whether she had authority, made him sit. "The previous manager, Mr. Fielding," Amelia said. "Do you know where he went?" "Heard he moved to Bristol," Gideon said carefully. "Why?" "Because he took roughly £800 from this estate over the course of 3 years through a series of falsified supplier invoices, and I intend to document every one of them in case your employer wishes to pursue it." She looked up from the papers. "Does that surprise you?" Gideon Marsh was quiet for a moment. "No," he said finally. "I had a feeling something wasn't right, but I couldn't prove it. You wouldn't have been able to not without training in accounts." She said it without condescension, just as a fact. "That's not your failing. It's a gap that was deliberately exploited." She turned a page. "Now, tell me about the tenants. Who is struggling and what do they need?" he told her. He told her for 2 hours, and she listened the entire time without interrupting, and she took notes in a handwriting so small and precise it looked like it had been printed by a machine. And when he finished, she asked 3 questions that made him realize she had not only heard everything he'd said, but had already begun solving for it. "You're not what I expected," he said when they finally stopped. "No." Amelia agreed. "I rarely am." The first month was brutal, not because the work was too hard. The work, if anything, was the easiest part. Numbers were consistent. Problems once correctly identified had solutions. Amelia could sit with a ledger for 6 hours and feel none of the exhaustion she felt after 30 minutes of pretending to be something she wasn't at a dinner party. The hard part was the resistance. It came from everywhere and wore different faces. The suppliers who refused to negotiate with a woman who asked to speak to her employer, who sent their responses addressed to Mr. Whitmore, and seemed genuinely perplexed when she continued writing back herself. The neighboring property owners who paid courtesy calls out of curiosity and left looking unsettled. The workers who tested her early, who came to her with problems she suspected they were exaggerating, waiting to see if she'd panic or defer. She didn't panic. She didn't defer. She negotiated with the suppliers through letters so detailed and so economically precise that several of them eventually responded in good faith, simply because they could tell she understood their business better than they expected. She met with the neighboring owners over tea, answered their questions directly, and watched two of them leave with a grudging respect they hadn't arrived with. She listened to the workers' problems, addressed the real ones immediately, and let the exaggerated ones resolve themselves once people saw she wasn't going to be manipulated. She did all of this alone. There was no one to advise her. There was no one to consult. There were letters from her mother, brief and careful, asking if she was comfortable, never asking if she was happy, because that was a question that had never been entirely comfortable in the Whitmore household. There were letters from her father, businesslike, asking about the property's progress. She wrote back with facts. She sent detailed quarterly reports that she knew her father had no framework to fully understand, but that she continued producing anyway, because documentation was its own form of integrity. She was lonely. She was not going to pretend otherwise, even to herself. There were evenings when the house was quiet and the accounts were finished, and she sat in the study with nothing to solve and felt the particular weight of a life lived mostly inside her own head. But she was also, for the first time, free. Not the grand theatrical freedom of adventure stories. The quiet freedom of a woman who for the first time was not being asked to be less than she was. Thornfield didn't care about her manners. The land didn't care about her opinions. The numbers didn't care about her gender. She could simply be competent, openly, completely, without apology. It was, she realized, the first time she had ever fully exhaled. By the end of the first year, Thornfield's accounts had moved from deeply in the red to borderline solvent. By the middle of the second year, the property was operating at a modest but genuine profit for the first time in a decade. Gideon Marsh had stopped looking at her like an anomaly and started looking at her like an ally. The workers who had tested her early now came to her first, not as a last resort. Two of the neighboring property owners had quietly requested her opinion on their own accounts, which she gave in writing professionally without drawing attention to the fact that they had asked. She hired a young woman from the village named Clara as a household assistant because she finally had enough in the operating budget to justify it, and because she had been making her own tea for 19 months and was reasonably tired of it. Clara was 19 quick and had the particular quality that Amelia had come to value above almost everything else. She asked questions. Real questions, not polite ones. She wanted to understand how things worked. "Why do you write everything down?" Clara asked one afternoon, watching Amelia compile her weekly summary. "Because memory is unreliable, and people lie," Amelia said. "But numbers don't lie, and if you write things down correctly, you always have proof." Clara considered that. "My mother says women shouldn't trouble themselves with all that." "Your mother is wrong," Amelia said, not unkindly. Clara smiled just slightly. "That's what I thought." The storm came on the third anniversary of Amelia's arrival at Thornfield. Not the metaphorical kind. An actual storm, the kind that arrives in early October, with a violence that feels personal, that strips the leaves before their time, and turns the roads to mud, and makes the countryside look like a painting of itself, rather than the thing itself. Amelia was in the study working through the harvest accounts when she heard the carriage. She heard it before she saw it. The sound of wheels on the drive, which was unusual because no one drove to Thornfield in weather like this, unless it was urgent and she wasn't expecting anyone. Gideon knocked on the study door and opened it before she could respond. Which meant whatever was outside was not the kind of thing that waited for permission. "There's a carriage at the gate," he said. "Very fine. Black with a crest I don't recognize. 4 horses. The driver says his employer requests to speak with the property's manager." Amelia set down her pen. "Did he give a name?" "Duke Alexander Ravenshire," Gideon said. And then, with the slightly dazed quality of a man who is still processing the information, he says he's been traveling for 2 days. Amelia was very still for a moment. She knew the name. Everyone in the county knew the name. The Ravenshire title was one of the oldest in the region, and the current duke had inherited it. Young inherited it, along with an estate that most people in the know described as impressive from the outside and deeply troubled from the inside. She had never met him. She had seen him once briefly at a gathering 3 years ago. He had been standing at the edge of the room, watching the other guests, with the particular expression of a man who is doing a calculation no one else can see. She had thought at the time that she recognized something in that expression. She had dismissed the thought immediately. "Tell him I'll receive him in the study," she said. Gideon blinked. "In the study, not the—" "In the study," Amelia repeated. "This is where I work. If he's come to speak with the property's manager, this is where we speak." Alexander Ravenshire was taller than she remembered. He came into the study with the controlled ease of a man who had been raised to enter rooms as if he owned them, and he stopped when he saw her. Not a dramatic stop, just a fraction of a second, where his forward momentum paused as his eyes moved over the organized chaos of the desk. The stacked ledgers, the accounts spread across every available surface. Then his gaze landed on her, who was perhaps 30. His face was the kind of face that would be called handsome by anyone paying attention and overlooked by anyone who wasn't, because his features were precise rather than dramatic, and his expression tended towards stillness rather than display. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Your Grace," she replied. She did not stand. She was sitting at her desk, which was a deliberate choice because a man who sat in front of her desk was a man in a meeting, and she intended for this to be a meeting. "You've traveled a long way in very poor conditions. Can I offer you something before we talk?" "Tea would be welcome," he said. He sat without being invited, to which she noted. Not rudeness, more like a man who was accustomed to making himself at home in every space, not out of arrogance, but out of an habitual practicality. Clara appeared in the doorway with uncanny timing. Amelia sent her for tea. Then she looked at Alexander Ravenshire and waited. He looked back at her. His eyes were darker than she'd remembered, a gray that shifted depending on the light. Right now, they were the color of the storm outside. "You remember me," he said. "I remember most people I've met," she said. "You were at the Berkshire gathering in the spring of 1818. You stood at the east wall near the painting of the horses and watched the room for most of the evening." Something in his expression shifted very slightly. "And you?" "Excuse me. I watched the room," he said. "And you, particularly when you spoke to Harwick." He paused. "I thought you were right for what it's worth." The room was quiet except for the storm against the windows. "No one said so at the time," Amelia observed. "No," he agreed. "They didn't. But I was the one who went home and checked Harwick's publicly reported numbers against the county records, and you were correct by an even wider margin than you stated. His estate was in worse condition than you realized." Amelia set down her pen completely. "And you've come here now because—" "Because my estate is in trouble," Alexander said. He said it plainly without the oblique maneuvering she had expected. "Not unlike Harwick's, though, for different reasons. My managers are honest men mostly, but they are neither capable enough nor innovative enough to solve the problems I'm facing. My advisors have recommended I marry for capital, find a wealthy wife with useful connections, and use the union to stabilize the estate." "That is a fairly conventional solution," Amelia said. "I'm not interested in conventional solutions." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm here because I spent the last several months researching what had happened to the Whitmore property in Thornfield, because I'd been told it was essentially a failing estate. And what I found instead was a property that has gone from significant deficit to modest profit in under 2 years, with innovation in tenant management that I've not seen documented anywhere else in the region." She said nothing. "I wanted to know who was doing it," he said. "And now you know," Amelia said. "And now I know," he agreed. He studied her for a moment. "I came here with a question. Not a request, and not an offer, not yet. A question." "Ask it." If someone came to you with a failing estate, one larger in scale than this, more complex in its problems with more internal resistance to change, could you fix it? Clara arrived with the tea tray. The sound of cups being arranged on the desk filled the silence, while Amelia considered the question. Not the answer which she already knew, but the question what it meant that he was asking it this way without preamble, without the social softening she was accustomed to from men who wanted something from her. "That depends," she said when Clara had gone, "on whether the person who owned the estate was willing to actually implement what I told him." Alexander wrapped both hands around the teacup. "And if he was—" "Then yes," Amelia said. "I could fix it." He nodded once, as if she had confirmed something he had already believed. Then he said, "My estate is called Ravenshire Hall. It has been in my family for 200 years. It employs directly or indirectly nearly 300 people. Its debts are significant, but not terminal. Its primary problems are a decade of poor management decisions made before I inherited the title, and an internal culture that has been resistant to accountability." "How resistant?" Amelia asked. "The kind where the people doing the most damage are also the most senior, and removing them creates political consequences I've been told I can't afford." "You can't afford not to remove them," Amelia said immediately. "I know that," he said. "I knew that when I was told I couldn't. I need someone who can help me prove it to everyone else." She looked at him, directly. The way she looked at everyone, without the downward flicker she'd been taught was appropriate for young women of her station. "You're describing a significant undertaking," she said. "Several years at minimum. Considerable personal and professional friction. Potential public conflict with people who have more social power than either of us." She paused. "What exactly are you proposing?" He held her gaze. "I'm proposing we have a longer conversation tomorrow when I haven't just driven through a storm for 6 hours." He set down his cup. "But the shape of it, yes. I'm proposing something significant." He stood. "I would like to impose on your hospitality tonight if I may. And in the morning, with clearer heads, I'd like to tell you what I actually came here to ask." Amelia looked at this man standing in her study, in her house, asking for shelter in her storm. She thought about what he had said. She thought about what he hadn't said yet, but what she could already see assembled in the architecture of this conversation. She thought about Thornfield and what she had done with it, and the careful, quiet pride she felt every time she looked at the accounts and saw a property breathing again. She thought about what it would mean to work at a scale she had never attempted with resources she had never had access to, on problems more complex and consequential than anything she had yet solved. She thought about what her father had said in that carriage. "You are too clever to stay among respectable people." She wondered if for once someone was telling her the opposite. "The East guest room is made up," she said. "Dinner is at 7, and your grace—" She waited until he turned back. "Whatever you came here to ask me, ask it plainly. I don't have patience for anything else." Alexander Ravenshire looked at her for a long moment. And then, for the first time since he'd walked into the room, something that was very nearly a smile crossed his face. "I had heard that about you," he said. And he left the study, and Amelia sat alone with the storm pressing against the windows and the accounts spread across her desk, and she did not pick up her pen again for a very long time. She did not sleep easily that night. Not because she was frightened, she had never been particularly prone to fear, but because her mind would not stop working, which was its habitual condition, and therefore theoretically comfortable and practically exhausting. She kept returning to the way he had entered the room. Not the entrance itself, but the way his eyes had moved over her desk. There was a kind of recognition in it that she was not accustomed to. Most people looked at her desk and saw disorder. They saw a woman overwhelmed by things she shouldn't have been doing in the first place. They offered to help her find someone more qualified. Alexander Ravenshire had looked at her desk the way she looked at a ledger she hadn't yet had time to read, with the specific attention of someone who wanted to understand how it worked. She lay in the dark listening to the storm ease off toward midnight and thought about what a man like that might actually be asking. She had learned through 3 years of working alone and 24 negotiations with suppliers and tenants and neighboring property owners that what people said they wanted and what they actually wanted were frequently two entirely different things, and the gap between those two things was where most of the world's trouble lived. She suspected Alexander Ravenshire was being honest with her. That was the unsettling part. She was better prepared for men who weren't. She fell asleep sometime after 2 in the morning, with the accounts still laid out in her head, and woke before 5, with the same clarity. She always woke with the particular sharpness of a mind that had been processing while the body rested. By the time he came downstairs at 7:30, she had already been at her desk for 2 hours, and when Gideon showed him into the study and he appeared in the doorway, she was ready. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "Ask me what you actually came here to ask," she said. And the storm had ended, and the morning light was cold and clear, and Alexander Ravenshire looked at Amelia Whitmore across the organized wreckage of her desk, and finally plainly said, "I need a duchess." She had known. She had known it since the moment he said significant. But hearing it aloud was still different. It landed with a different weight. "A duchess," she repeated. "Not a decorative one," he said immediately. "Not someone to stand beside me at social functions and manage the household schedule. Those things need doing, but they are not what I'm here for." He leaned forward. "I need someone with your particular skill. Your ability to see through the way things are presented to the way they actually are. Your willingness to do it publicly, even when it's uncomfortable." He paused. "Especially when it's uncomfortable." "What you're describing is not a marriage proposal," Amelia said. "It's a business arrangement." "It's both," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise. I need competence. I also need a partner who will be respected legally and socially, whose authority within Ravenshire will not be subject to constant challenge. The title matters. The marriage matters. But not more than the capability." He held her gaze. "Miss Whitmore, I have met perhaps 3 people in my life who I believed could understand what is wrong with my estate and actually fix it. You are the only one of those 3 who has actually done it. That is not a coincidence I am prepared to ignore." Amelia sat with that for a moment. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was slightly elevated, which annoyed her. "You said yesterday that you had conditions," Alexander said. "I'm telling you now that I'm willing to hear them." She had expected to have more time to prepare this list. She had been constructing it in her head since approximately 4 in the morning. "Complete authority over the household and estate accounts," she said. "Not oversight, authority. Any financial decision below a threshold we agree on in advance is mine to make without consultation. Above that threshold we discuss it. But discuss means discuss, not a conversation where you have already decided and are waiting for me to agree." "Accepted," he said. "Any manager or employee I identify as corrupt, negligent, or insufficient for their position, I have the right to dismiss them. With appropriate documentation, which I will always provide. But I will not have my decisions undermined by the political discomfort they cause." "Accepted," he said again. She studied him. "You're agreeing very easily." "I'm agreeing because I mean it," he said. "Men often mean things in the beginning." I was quiet for a moment. "That is fair," he said. "I don't know how to prove it to you except by doing what I say. I understand that's not sufficient proof at this stage." He looked at her steadily. "What else?" "My name," Amelia said. "When I solve problems at Ravenshire, those solutions are attributed correctly. Not to your management, not to an unnamed administrative improvement. If I restructure something, and it works, the people who need to know what I did should know what I did." A pause, longer than the others. "That one will cause some resistance," he said. "I know," Amelia said. "I'm not asking if it's convenient." Another pause, and then accepted. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. The way she looked at accounts she was trying to fully understand, not searching for a single answer, but taking the measure of the whole thing. "I'll need time to consider it," she said. "How much time?" "A week." He nodded. "I'll return in a week." He stood. He paused at the edge of the desk. "I want to say something," he said, "that I'd ask you to take as information rather than pressure." He waited for her to nod. "I have been watching what you've done here for 8 months. Before I drove 2 days through October weather to sit across from you. Not because I had nothing else to do with my time, but because I needed to know if what I'd seen at Harwick's dinner was a one-time performance or something real. He paused. It's real. You know it's real. I wanted you to know that I know it. She held his gaze and didn't look away and said nothing because there was nothing to say to that. He had simply told her the truth and she had received it, and they both knew what it was. He left. The carriage rolled away through the mud, and Gideon appeared in the doorway, looking like a man who was trying very hard to pretend he hadn't been listening. "Well," he said. "Well." Amelia agreed. "Are you going to?" "I'm going to think," she said. Quietly, without commentary. Gideon withdrew. Amelia turned back to her desk. The accounts were exactly where she had left them. The numbers were exactly what they had been before he arrived. But the study felt different now. The silence in it felt different, like the moment before a calculation resolves, that split second where you can see that the answer is coming, but you haven't quite arrived at it yet. She picked up her pen. She had a week to decide. She suspected she already knew. The week passed the way hard weeks always do, faster than she wanted and slower than she could bear. Amelia did not spend it agonizing. That was not how her mind worked. She spent it calculating. She made lists which she immediately set aside because she knew within the first 12 hours that the decision was not going to be made by a list. She walked the estate every morning the way she always did, because physical movement was the only thing that quieted the machinery inside her head long enough for her to hear what was underneath it. She thought about the numbers. Ravenshire Hall's publicly available records, the county filings, the land assessments, the information accessible to anyone who knew where to look and how to read it, told a story she had been quietly assembling in her head ever since Alexander Ravenshire had sat across from her and said the word significant. The estate was not in terminal decline. That was the first thing. Terminal decline had a different profile, a different rhythm to the numbers, a kind of cascading collapse that became self-reinforcing once it started. Ravenshire didn't look like that. It looked like something that had been mishandled for a decade by people who were well-intentioned and structurally incompetent, which was in many ways a harder problem than outright corruption, because corruption at least had a clear solution. She thought about his conditions, the ones he'd accepted and the one that had taken him a moment longer. That pause before accepted. On the third point, the attribution of her work was the most important piece of information he had given her, more important than anything he'd said directly. A man who paused before agreeing to something was a man who understood its weight. A man who agreed anyway was a man who might actually mean it. She thought about what she was giving up if she said no. She looked around at Thornfield, at what she had built here, at the accounts she could now read in 20 minutes without breaking a sweat, because there was no longer anything in them that surprised her, and she felt the particular restlessness of a mind that had finished one problem and was hungry for the next. She was not restless because she was bored. She was restless because she was capable of more than this, and she knew it, and pretending otherwise had never been something she was any good at. On the 6th day, she wrote him a letter. She wrote it 3 times. The first version was too long. The second version was too careful, full of qualifications she didn't mean. The third version was 4 sentences. I have considered your proposal. I have 3 additional conditions beyond those we discussed. If you are willing to hear them in person, I will be available Thursday morning at 9. If not, I will remain at Thornfield, and we will not need to speak again. She sent it before she could reconsider. He arrived Thursday at 8:45, which told her something. A man who arrives 15 minutes early to a meeting where the other person set the time is a man who is taking it seriously. She was already at her desk. Clara showed him in without being asked, because Clara had apparently decided on her own authority that the Duke of Ravenshire could be trusted with the study, and Amelia made a mental note to discuss with her later what the appropriate protocols were for a household that was not yet sure what it was dealing with. He sat. He did not appear to have slept particularly well, which was the first humanizing thing she had observed about him. Your 3 additional conditions, he said. Before I give them, Amelia said, I want you to answer something honestly, and I'll know if you're being diplomatic instead. His expression didn't change. Ask. Why isn't there already someone at Ravenshire doing what you're asking me to do? You've had this estate for 6 years since your father died. You're clearly not a man who avoids difficult decisions. Why has this gone on this long? A pause. Not the kind where he was deciding whether to answer, but the kind where he was deciding how much of the answer to give. Because the people I trusted to advise me about who to hire had a vested interest in keeping the right people out, he said finally. My father's senior advisors remained on in advisory roles after I took the title. They controlled the information I received. By the time I understood the scale of what was happening, I had already made decisions based on their guidance that made it difficult to remove them without significant legal and social exposure. He stopped. I was 24 years old, and I was told I was being guided by experience. I was being managed. The room was very quiet. How long before you realized it? Amelia asked. 2 years, he said. And 2 more to build the documentation necessary to remove the worst of them without catastrophic consequence. I have managed to separate the most damaging individuals, but the structural problems they created are still there. The remaining staff is demoralized and confused about authority. The estate's financial processes are tangled enough that I cannot get a clear picture of where the money is going. He held her gaze. So the honest answer to your question is, I have been working on this problem for 4 years, and what I need now is someone who can see what I no longer can, because I have been too close to it for too long. Amelia nodded slowly. It was, she thought, the most honest answer she had received from a powerful man about the limits of his own power. It was also the answer of someone who had done things the hard way for long enough that he wasn't going to pretend otherwise. My 3 additional conditions, she said. I'm listening. First, any agreement between us regarding the management of Ravenshire is documented. In writing. Not informally, not in letters, but in a legal agreement that specifies my authority clearly and is signed before we proceed with anything else. I will not operate on good faith alone. Good faith is not enforceable. Agreed. Second, my presence at Ravenshire, my role in any improvements that occur, is not concealed from the estate staff. The people working under me need to know who they're reporting to and why. If you require me to operate through proxies or to credit my decisions to someone with a more acceptable title, I will not come. He was quiet for a moment. That will create friction with certain members of my household. Yes, Amelia said. It will. I need to know if that's a deal breaker for you. He looked at her directly. It isn't. Third, she said. And here she stopped for just a fraction of a second, because this was the one she had rewritten the most. If this arrangement becomes a marriage, which I understand is what you're proposing, I will not be introduced to society as the Duke's wife who manages his household. I will be introduced as myself, Amelia Whitmore, who manages his estate. My name and my work are the same thing, and I won't have them separated for anyone's comfort, including yours. The silence stretched. She watched his face. She was good at watching faces, not for emotion exactly, but for the specific involuntary reactions that happened before a person decided what expression to present. The slight shift around the eyes. The almost imperceptible recalibration. That third condition, he said slowly, is going to create consequences I cannot fully predict. I know, she said. And you're asking for it anyway. I'm not asking, she said quietly. I'm stating it. Those are my terms. You came here because of who I am. I'm telling you who I am requires that my name be attached to what I do. Another silence. Longer. Agreed, he said, and she believed him. She wasn't entirely sure why, except that it was the same quality she had heard in his voice when he'd told her about the years of mismanagement, the same absence of performance that she had been identifying as his most distinctive characteristic since he first walked into her study. She had spent her whole life in rooms full of people performing. She found the absence of it almost disorienting. Then I accept, she said. He looked at her. Just for a moment, something moved across his face that wasn't calculation, wasn't planning. It was gone before she could identify it with precision. But it was there. We'll need to speak to a solicitor, he said, reverting to the practical which she respected. I have one, Amelia said. In the city. He's handled Thornfield's affairs, and he is thorough. My solicitor is also thorough. Then they can be thorough together, she said. He almost smiled again. She was beginning to recognize it not as an expression exactly, but as a quality that briefly replaced his usual stillness. Like a window opening in a room that was typically kept closed. There's one more thing, he said. She waited. My mother will be the most significant obstacle you face at Ravenshire. Not the accounts, not the staff. Her. I want you to know that before we proceed, because I don't believe in letting people walk into situations I could have warned them about. Tell me about her, Amelia said. She is the Dowager Duchess. She has lived at Ravenshire her entire married life and considers herself its true authority, regardless of what the law says. She is not cruel exactly, but she is precise about what she believes women in our position should and should not do, and her opinion of what I'm proposing will be immediate and clear. Has she expressed it already? A fractional pause. I mentioned to her that I was considering an unconventional approach to the estate's management. She told me I was making an error my father would not have made. And what did you say? I said my father's management is part of how the estate got into this condition, Alexander said. And then I drove to Thornfield. Amelia was quiet for a moment. I am not afraid of her, she said. I didn't think you were, he said. I wanted you to know about her because you deserve to know what you're walking into, not to discourage you. She nodded. She thought about a woman who had spent decades as the center of a world that was about to have its center moved, and she felt, despite everything, a small, sharp recognition. Not sympathy precisely, but understanding. When would you want me at Ravenshire? She said. The legal agreements first, he said. Then if you're willing, within the month. Within the month, she agreed. The solicitors met the following week in the city, and the meeting lasted 4 hours and left Amelia's solicitor, a meticulous man named Mr. Croft, who had been doing estate law for 30 years, slightly dazed in a way she found privately satisfying. Not because she had overwhelmed him, but because he kept looking up from the documents and glancing at her with the expression of a man adjusting a long-held assumption. Miss Whitmore, he said at one point, when they had negotiated a particularly contested clause regarding financial authority thresholds. This is thorough, she said. I was going to say unprecedented, he said. Thorough is better, she said. The agreement was signed on a Thursday afternoon, with both solicitors present, and a third witness, which Alexander had suggested, and Amelia had agreed to, because documentation was integrity, and she had meant what she told Clara about that. When they walked out of the solicitor's office afterward, onto the gray city street, Alexander said, I imagine the next few months will not be easy. No, Amelia agreed. I want to be honest about that. There will be people at Ravenshire, people I respect, even who are going to resist you in ways that have nothing to do with your competence and everything to do with what you represent. I know. And I cannot always intervene without making it worse. I know that too, she said. I've been managing resistance for 3 years without anyone to intervene on my behalf. I'm not asking you to fight my battles. He looked at her. Then what are you asking? She thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, because it was a question worth a real answer. Don't tell me the opposition doesn't exist, she said finally. Don't minimize it to spare my feelings. And don't make decisions that affect my authority without telling me first, even if you think you're protecting me. She paused. That's all. He nodded. I can do that. Good, she said. They stood on the street for a moment, in the particular silence that exists when two people have finished a significant conversation and have not yet decided what comes next. There is one last formality, he said, and his voice had shifted slightly, just slightly, from the register of business to something she didn't have a precise name for. Before we make any of this public, I would like to ask you properly, not because the legal documents require it, but because you deserve to be asked. Amelia looked at him. At this man she had met a total of 4 times, who had twice driven through terrible weather to sit across from her, who had agreed to conditions that should have been standard, and somehow weren't, who had told her the truth about his estate's failures with less self-protection than she had expected from someone with a great deal more to lose. Then ask, she said. He held her gaze. Will you marry me, Amelia? No title. No Miss Whitmore. Just her name the way people said it when they were saying the actual thing, rather than the formal wrapper around it. She had expected to feel something complicated at this moment. She had expected the weight of it, the calculation, the awareness of what she was agreeing to, and at what cost. She had not expected to feel something that was simpler than that. Something almost quiet. Yes, she said. Ravenshire Hall announced itself through its gate, before you ever saw the house, and the gate alone told you things. It was magnificent in the way that objects are magnificent when they've been great for so long, that greatness is now just maintenance. The ironwork was precise. The stone pillars perfectly proportioned, the whole thing radiating a kind of authority so habitual, it had stopped noticing itself. Amelia arrived on a cold November morning in Alexander's carriage, her 2 trunks and her accounts box, and Clara beside her, who had asked to come with a directness that Amelia had respected and agreed to without discussion. The estate staff was assembled in the entrance hall. 14 people from the senior housekeeper to the most junior footman, all standing with the particular expression of people who have been told to appear respectful and are doing their best. But the woman at the center of them seated, rather than standing in a chair that had no official claim to the entrance hall, but had clearly been placed there for this specific occasion, the Dowager Duchess Eleanor Ravenshire was not performing anything. She was perhaps 60, with a face that had once been conventionally beautiful, and had aged into something more interesting than that, a face that had opinions and was not embarrassed by them. She looked at Amelia the way a woman looks at something she has already judged and is now examining to see if the judgment requires revision. Alexander, standing beside Amelia, said, "Mother, this is Amelia." "I know who she is," Eleanor said. Her voice was the same controlled quietness his was. "I read the reports." There was a silence. Amelia did not fill it. She was learning that silences at Ravenshire were going to be a form of combat, and she intended to be very good at it. "You're smaller than I imagined," Eleanor said finally. "I'll take up more space as time goes on," Amelia said pleasantly. Something moved in Eleanor's eyes. Something that was not warmth, but was not hostility either. It was the particular response of a woman who has spent her life surrounded by people who defer to her encountering someone who doesn't. "We'll see about that," Eleanor said. And she stood, which was its own kind of acknowledgement, and left the entrance hall with the unhurried precision of a woman who always chose when to exit. Alexander said under his breath, "That was better than I expected." "It wasn't good," Amelia said. "No," he agreed. "But it wasn't a scene." "Give it time," Amelia said. She gave herself 48 hours to learn the house before she touched anything. This was deliberate. She walked every floor. She talked to every member of staff she could find, not formally, not with a clipboard, but in the way she had learned at Thornfield, just in passing, just asking the questions that people answered without realizing they were giving her information. The cook who mentioned the household food budget had not been adjusted in 6 years, which told her something. The senior footman who casually referred to a particular man in the accounts office as Mr. Henley's department, as if the accounts office were a territory with a border, that told her something too. On the morning of the 3rd day, she sat down at the desk Alexander had arranged for her in the estate office, her own desk beside his in a room where the estate's primary business was conducted, and she opened the accounts. She had been at Thornfield for 3 years. She had dealt with one dishonest manager and the mess he left. She had thought she knew what complicated accounts looked like. Ravenshire's accounts were not complicated. They were deliberately labyrinthine. Someone had built a system that looked organized and was structurally designed to prevent oversight. Not the crude falsification she'd found at Thornfield, but something more sophisticated. Layers of legitimate-looking categorizations that, when you traced them far enough, funneled money into ambiguous line items that could plausibly mean anything. It was the kind of system that required intelligence to build and required more intelligence to dismantle. She worked through the first morning in silence. Alexander came in twice, asked nothing, left tea on the corner of her desk. She barely noticed. By noon she had identified the architecture of it. By mid-afternoon she had found the first clear example. By the time Clara appeared in the doorway at 5 o'clock to tell her that dinner would be in an hour, she had 3 examples, each thoroughly documented, each pointing to the same name, Mr. Leonard Henley. head of estate accounts, 18 years in his position. She set down her pen and looked at what she had and felt two things simultaneously. The cold clarity of a problem, correctly identified, and the warmer, more complex recognition of how much work it was going to take to unwind what he had built. She told Alexander at dinner. Just the two of them, which was the arrangement they had agreed to for the first weeks while things settled. "Henley," he said. "Yes." I was quiet for a moment. "He's been here since before I inherited." "I know," she said. "He was recommended by my father's advisors." "I know," she said again. "That's consistent with the pattern. The people who were placed here specifically to prevent accountability are the ones who have been here the longest and will have the most personal loyalty from the longest-serving staff." She watched him carefully. "This is the part where you tell me if you're going to be able to do what needs to be done." He looked at her across the table. His expression was the controlled stillness she was becoming familiar with, but underneath it she could see not hesitation exactly, but the full awareness of what removing Henley would cost in terms of internal disruption. "How solid is your documentation?" he said. "Solid enough to survive a legal challenge," she said. "I have 3 clean examples already, and I've only been in the accounts for 1 day. I'll have more by the end of the week. How much do you estimate has been taken?" She named a figure. The stillness on his face shifted into something considerably sharper. "That much." "At minimum," she said. He set down his fork. "Document everything," he said. "When you have what you need, bring it to me. We'll deal with it together." She nodded. "And Amelia?" He waited until she looked up. "When you say your documentation is solid, I trust that. I want you to know I trust that. I'm not going to second-guess your analysis or ask someone else to verify it." She had not known how much she needed someone to say that until the moment he said it. She said, "Thank you," and meant it in a way that had no qualifications attached. She had been at Ravenshire for 11 days when Eleanor found her in the estate office alone. She had seen the Dowager Duchess at breakfast and at dinner, both times in company. Both times characterized by a careful, watchful neutrality that Amelia had not mistaken for acceptance. Eleanor had said very little directly to her. She had said a great deal indirectly in the way practiced women of her generation could, through the quality of her attention, through the topics she chose to introduce or avoid, through the particular way she addressed Alexander in Amelia's presence, which was the way a woman speaks to a son when she is reminding him gently that she knew him before this new thing arrived. On the 11th day, the door to the estate office opened at 10 in the morning when Alexander was out meeting with a tenant and Eleanor walked in. Amelia did not stand. She was not being rude. She was at her desk doing the work she had come here to do, and she had made a decision very early in her life that she would not perform the physical gestures of deference for people whose authority over her she did not accept. Eleanor noticed. Of course she noticed. "You're not going to stand," Eleanor said. "I'm in the middle of something that requires concentration," Amelia said. "Please sit down. I'll finish this line, and then I'll give you my full attention." The silence that followed that sentence was remarkable in its complexity. Eleanor sat. She sat the way a woman sits when she is deciding whether to be offended or whether to file what just happened in a different category entirely. Amelia finished the line. She set down her pen. She looked at Eleanor directly. "You want to tell me something," Amelia said. "I'd rather you say it plainly." Eleanor looked at her for a long moment. "You are going to cause a great deal of disruption," she said. "Yes," Amelia agreed. "My son believes that is necessary." "Your son is correct." "He is often correct," Eleanor said with the tone of a woman who finds it slightly inconvenient. "His father was also often correct, and it did not prevent him from making decisions whose consequences took decades to manage." She paused. "I am not your enemy, Miss Whitmore." "Mrs. Ravenshire," Amelia said, correcting the title gently. "And I didn't assume you were." "Then what did you assume?" "That you love this estate, and you love your son, and you're not sure yet whether I'm good for either of them," Amelia said. "That's not enmity. That's caution. I respect caution." Eleanor was quiet. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, still not that, but a recalibration. The same thing Amelia had seen in Mr. Croft's face in the solicitor's office. The adjustment of an expectation. Leonard Henley, Eleanor said carefully, has been part of this household for 18 years. There it was. Amelia had wondered when this would come. I know, Amelia said. He was a personal recommendation of my late husband. I know that too, Amelia said. Whatever you believe you found, I've found it, Amelia said, not harshly. I'm not speculating. I have documentation. By the end of this week, I'll have more. She looked at Eleanor steadily. I understand that what I'm going to do will be uncomfortable. It will be personally uncomfortable, because it will mean acknowledging that someone your husband trusted was actively stealing from this family for years. I understand that's painful. She paused. But I need to know clearly whether you're going to work against what I'm doing. Because I am going to do it regardless, and it will be significantly easier for everyone if I know in advance where the resistance is coming from. Eleanor looked at her. A long, assessing look. The look of a woman who has been managing complex social situations since before Amelia was born, encountering a problem she doesn't have an existing framework for. You're not afraid of me, Eleanor said. No, Amelia said. Most people are. I'm aware. Why aren't you? Amelia thought about it honestly. Because I'm not trying to take anything from you, she said. I'm not here for your position or your influence or your relationship with your son. I'm here to fix something that's broken. Those two things don't conflict. Another long silence. I will not work against you, Eleanor said finally. I make no promises beyond that. That's enough, Amelia said. Eleanor stood. She moved toward the door and then stopped. You corrected Harwick at his own dinner table, she said without turning around. Yes. I heard about it. At the time I thought... She stopped. I thought it was very foolish. It was arguably impractical, Amelia acknowledged. And now I find myself wondering, Eleanor said very quietly, what would have happened if I had done something like that? 30 years ago. She stopped again. Good morning, Mrs. Ravenshire. She left. Amelia sat very still for a moment. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work because the accounts were waiting and feeling things was something she was going to have to do later. Mr. Henley was dismissed on a Thursday morning 17 days after Amelia's arrival at Ravenshire. She did it properly. She had the documentation organized in a leather folder dated and cross-referenced. She and Alexander were both present. Alexander said very little, 2 sentences at the beginning explaining why they were meeting. Then he stepped back. Because that had been the agreement, her authority, her work, her name on the result. Henley was 53 years old and had spent 18 years constructing himself as indispensable. He looked at Amelia across the desk with an expression she had been expecting. Not guilt, not shame, but outrage. The specific outrage of a man who has been caught by someone he hadn't thought capable of catching him. You can't be serious, he said. He said it to Alexander, not to Amelia. Mr. Henley, Amelia said. The documentation in front of you represents 6 months of account irregularities totaling. She named the figure, which is recoverable from your estate under the terms outlined on page 4. You have 2 options. You accept those terms quietly and leave today with your reputation publicly intact. Or you contest it, in which case this documentation becomes part of a legal proceeding, and several people in this county begin asking questions about your accounts that I suspect you'd prefer they not ask. She paused. I suggest you read page 4. He looked at her then. Really looked at her. And she watched him understand not just what she had on him, but what kind of mind had assembled it. The look on his face in that moment was something she recognized because she had seen versions of it her whole life. The moment when someone who had written you off realizes they wrote off the wrong person. You did this, he said to her. Low. Not quite a question. I did, she said. He looked at Alexander. You're going to let her? Mr. Henley, Alexander said with a quiet that ended the sentence completely. The decision has been made. Henley left 40 minutes later. The staff by end of day had heard. Amelia didn't pretend otherwise. She never pretended otherwise, because ambiguity bred more disruption than clarity. She sent a brief factual memo to every department head explaining that the accounts office was under new management, and that the transition would be orderly. That evening at dinner, Alexander said, "You handled that well." "I handled it correctly," she said. "Those aren't always the same thing," he said. "In this case, they were." He looked at her across the table with that quality she had stopped trying to name and started accepting as part of his particular grammar. "Yes," he said. "In this case, they were." Outside Ravenshire Hall settled into its evening silences. The accounts were already cleaner than they'd been in a decade. The estate was watching her the way an institution watches a new authority, with a collective held-breath attention that could tip in either direction depending on what happened next. Amelia poured her tea. She had 17 more problems on her list. She would start on the first one in the morning. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, and for the first time in her life, everyone around her was beginning slowly, resistantly to understand it too. The weeks after Henley's dismissal were not quiet. Amelia had not expected them to be. What she had not fully anticipated was the specific shape the resistance would take. Not open confrontation. Ravenshire's remaining staff was too trained for that, too conditioned by years of operating in a household where you did not openly challenge authority. What happened instead was the particular friction of people who had decided not to help without ever committing to obstruction. Documents that arrived late. Requests that were acknowledged and then ignored for 3 days. Information she asked for that appeared on her desk with key pages missing, always by accident, always with a very believable apology attached. It was, she thought, actually more sophisticated than what she'd dealt with at Thornfield. At Thornfield, the resistance had been simple skepticism. People who doubted her because they hadn't seen what she could do. This was different. This was an institution that had learned over many years to protect itself by appearing cooperative while being anything but. She adapted. She always adapted. She started building parallel information streams, asking the same questions of multiple people, cross-referencing answers, identifying the gaps that revealed where the cooperation was performed rather than real. She documented everything, not because she was preparing a legal case, but because documentation was the only thing that made patterns visible, and patterns were the only thing she actually trusted. Clara became in this period more valuable than Amelia had anticipated. Not because she had any financial expertise, she didn't, but because Clara moved through the household in a way Amelia couldn't. The junior staff spoke differently to Clara than they spoke to the new Duchess. They said things in the kitchen and the hallways that they would never say in the estate office. Clara reported these things to Amelia each evening with the careful precision of someone who had grasped, without being explicitly told, that accuracy mattered more than loyalty to any particular version of events. "They're not afraid of you," Clara said one evening, which was a more useful observation than it sounded. "No," Amelia said. "They were afraid of Mr. Henley," Clara said. "Not you. They think—" She stopped. "Say it." "They think you'll be gone before spring," Clara said. "The ones who've been here longest. They think His Grace will that things will settle back to how they were." Amelia set down her pen. She thought about that for a moment. Not with offense, but with the analytical attention she gave everything. Who specifically thinks this? Clara gave her 3 names. Amelia wrote them down and looked at them and made no immediate decision because the right response to that information was not speed, it was patience. Let them believe what they believed. Let them wait for her to fail. She had been doing that, existing in the space of someone else's certainty about her failure her entire life. She was very practiced at it. The first major result came 6 weeks after her arrival, and it came from somewhere she had not entirely predicted: the tenants. Ravenshire had 43 tenant families on its lands. Henley's accounting methods had obscured what was actually happening with their rents, which meant that for years no one at the hall had a clear picture of who was paying what, who was in genuine hardship, and who had been quietly exploited by a rental structure that made sense on paper and was vicious in practice. Amelia had spent the better part of 2 weeks reconstructing the actual rental situation, and what she found was both worse and more correctable than she'd expected. 7 families were in arrears, not because they were unwilling to pay, but because they had been charged for drainage improvements that had never been made. 12 more were paying inflated rates that bore no relationship to the productivity of their land. 3 had been quietly paying double, once to the estate and once to a local agent who had no documented authority to collect anything. She brought this to Alexander on a Tuesday morning with a 15-page document she had worked through the weekend to complete. He read it at his desk while she watched. He read it the way she had learned he read difficult things, very still, very fast, without the visible emotional reactions most people showed when confronted with information that required significant response. She had come to understand this not as coldness, but as a different processing method. He felt things. He was simply very economical about when he showed it. When he finished, he looked up. "The 3 families paying double," he said. "The agent's name." "Page 12, she said. He turned to it. He read the page. "I know this man," he said very quietly. "I assumed you might," she said. "He's been operating in this area for 15 years. He set the document down. "I is not going to respond well to being exposed." "No," she agreed. "But the 3 families he's been double collecting from have been overpaying for 6 years, and they deserve the money back." He looked at her. "I am not suggesting we do nothing. I'm telling you what's coming." "Tell me what specifically." "He has connections to 2 members of the county commission," Alexander said. "Men who have been cooperative with Ravenshire interests in the past. If we move against him, that cooperation may become complicated." "How important is that cooperation currently?" Amelia asked. Howe was quiet for a moment. "Less important than it was," he said carefully. "I've been working for 2 years to reduce our dependence on county commission relationships that were built on quid pro quo foundations, because those relationships are inherently unstable. So the answer is that it will be complicated but manageable." He looked at her again. "You've already decided." "I decided when I found the documentation," she said. "I'm telling you because we agreed to discuss things above the threshold. This is above the threshold." He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Do it. Document everything as you go." "I already am," she said. The rents were restructured over 3 weeks. The agent was confronted with documentation that gave him the same 2 options. Henley had been given quiet restitution or public legal proceeding, and he chose the former because men like him always chose the former, when you had enough on paper to make the alternative genuinely costly. The 7 families with the drainage arrears had their accounts cleared. The 12 families with inflated rates received revised contracts. Word traveled the way. Word travels in the countryside, which is to say, faster than any one official would have predicted, and with more accuracy than rumor typically managed. Amelia did not orchestrate it. She simply did the work and let the work speak. A woman named Mrs. Aldridge, whose family had been farming Ravenshire land for 2 generations, appeared at the hall on a Thursday morning and asked to speak with the Duchess. Clara showed her into the small sitting room off the main hall, and Amelia came and sat across from her, and Mrs. Aldridge, who was perhaps 55, and had a face marked by 20 years of outdoor work and real worry, put a tin on the table between them. "Preserves," she said. "From our orchard this autumn. It's not much." "It's generous," Amelia said. Mrs. Aldridge looked at her with the direct, unadorned attention of a woman who had not spent her life learning to soften her gaze for social purposes. "What you did with the drainage arrears," she said. "None of us expected it." "It was owed," Amelia said. "Things that are owed don't always get paid," Mrs. Aldridge said, "especially when the people who owe them are the ones deciding whether to pay." She stopped. "My husband didn't believe it when I told him. He thought there'd be a catch." "There isn't one," Amelia said. Mrs. Aldridge nodded slowly. "I told him that too." She looked at Amelia with something that was very simple and very steady. "I just wanted to come say it directly." After she left, Amelia sat alone in the small sitting room for several minutes. She was not usually someone who needed to sit alone after meetings. But something about Mrs. Aldridge's face, the particular combination of skepticism and tentative relief, had hit somewhere it wasn't supposed to. She thought about what it meant to be the person who finally did what should have been done years ago, and whether that was something to feel proud of or something to feel the weight of. She decided it was both, and that both were appropriate, and she picked up the tin of preserves and went back to work. She had been at Ravenshire for 2 months when the social invitations began. This was not a surprise. She had expected them. The county's established families were curious about her in the way people are curious about things that disrupt their existing categories. She was not the wife they had expected Alexander Ravenshire to produce. She was considerably more interesting than that, and considerably more threatening, and social curiosity and social threat often presented as the same thing when they arrived in the form of dinner invitations. Alexander asked her the first time one arrived whether she wanted to go. "I want to know who sent it," she said. He told her. Lady Carmichael, wife of the county's largest private landowner, a woman of considerable influence and the kind of established social authority that made her opinion of the new Duchess relevant in ways Amelia found tedious but not ignorable. "Then we should go," Amelia said. "You understand what it will be like," Alexander said. "I'll be studied," she said. "Tested. People will ask me questions that are not the questions they're actually asking. Women who feel threatened will be politely cutting, and women who are curious will be carefully friendly, and men will either ignore me or address everything to you while technically speaking to me." She paused. "I've been doing this my whole life. I'm quite good at it." He looked at her with that quality again, the one that briefly replaced his stillness. "I don't doubt it," he said. The Carmichael dinner was everything she had predicted, and one thing she hadn't. The thing she hadn't predicted was Lord Everley. She recognized him before he recognized her, which gave her a few seconds to prepare, which was exactly the kind of advantage she had learned to use. Lord Everley was perhaps 50, well-dressed, with the particular care of a man who considered his appearance a form of argument, and he was speaking to a group near the fireplace when she entered with Alexander and stopped mid-sentence. She watched his face go through the recognition. Watched him locate the memory a dinner 3 years ago, a young woman who had embarrassed him in front of his business partners with mathematical evidence he still couldn't publicly refute. She watched him decide in the space of approximately 4 seconds how to handle it. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had decided the best approach was to reclaim the narrative before she could. He crossed the room. He greeted Alexander first, which was correct protocol, and then he turned to Amelia with the particular warmth of a man performing graciousness so visibly that it defeated itself. "Duchess Ravenshire," he said. "What a remarkable turn of events." "Lord Everley," she said pleasantly. "How is your estate? I haven't seen the county reports recently." The warmth in his expression didn't disappear exactly. It reconfigured itself into something slightly more fixed. "Thriving," he said. "Wonderful," she said, and turned to accept a glass from a passing footman, which ended the exchange at exactly the right moment. Alexander beside her said nothing, but she felt the slight shift in his posture that she had started to recognize as the physical expression of things he was not going to say aloud. Later on the way home, he said Everley. "Yes," she said. "I know his history with you." She looked at him. "Do you?" "I told you I researched what happened at Harwick's dinner before I came to Thornfield," he said. "Everley was in the room. He was the one who spread the story afterward. He was the one who made sure the version of events that circulated was the least flattering one." She had suspected something like this. She had not known the specifics. "How do you know it was him?" "Because I spent 3 weeks finding out," Alexander said simply. "Before I came to you. I wanted to understand everything about what you'd been through and who had been responsible for it." The carriage was quiet for a moment. "You investigated the people who had harmed me," she said. "I investigated the circumstances that led to Thornfield," he said. "The people were part of the circumstances." She turned this over in her mind. She was not sure what to do with it. She had spent so long being someone that people explained, told stories about past judgments on positioned in whatever way served their narrative, that someone spending 3 weeks investigating in order to understand her, rather than to use the understanding, was a category she didn't have existing furniture for. "What are you planning to do with what you know about Everley?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Unless you want me to." "I don't," she said. Not yet. He looked at her. Not yet. He's going to do something, she said. Men like Everly don't sit still when they feel their position is challenged. He looked at me tonight and saw something that unsettles him, and the way he manages things that unsettle him is to act on them. She paused. When he does, I want it to be on my terms. Alexander was quiet for a moment. You've been planning for this since we walked in the door. I've been planning for it since I knew he'd be there, she said. He looked at her with something that was not quite the almost smile, not quite the calculated assessment. Something that had more personal weight than either. I find that, he said carefully, both admirable and slightly alarming. Most useful things are, she said. Everly moved faster than she'd expected. Within 2 weeks of the Carmichael dinner, a story began circulating. She heard it first from Clara, who heard it from the housekeeper, who heard it from a tradesman who'd been talking to someone connected to Everly's household. The story was elegant in its construction, that the new Duchess Ravenshire was the real authority at the hall, that Alexander was being managed by a woman with no breeding and no understanding of the social responsibilities of her position, that what looked like a state improvement was actually a kind of hostile administrative takeover that left the Duke himself effectively a figurehead in his own house. It was, she noted with professional appreciation, well targeted. It didn't attack her intelligence. Attacking the intelligence of someone whose competence was already visible would have been too easily refuted. Instead, it attacked the thing she couldn't entirely prove by showing results: the nature of her relationship with Alexander. It suggested that his authority had been undermined rather than supported. It turned her competence into a weapon used against the man who had married her. She told Alexander at dinner. He listened without expression. When she finished, he said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to know if any part of what he's saying lands with you," she said directly. "Whether any part of you feels that way." He looked at her steadily. "No. I need you to be honest, not reassuring." "I am being honest," he said. "You have not undermined my authority. You have used the authority I agreed to give you in the ways we agreed, and the results have been better than I expected in the time I expected them to take. The only thing Everly's story has right is that you are the real authority over the estate's financial management, which was the agreement, which was the point." He paused. He's not wrong about the fact. He's lying about what it means. She nodded. She processed that. He's going to bring it publicly, she said. Something like this doesn't stay in private conversation. He's testing reactions before he commits to a larger move. I know, Alexander said. Which means we need to decide before he does. What's his estate's actual condition? Amelia asked. Alexander looked at her, just for a moment. I want to know, she said. County reports, public records, whatever I can access legitimately. If he's going to come for my position publicly, I want to know everything about his. Alexander was quiet for a moment. He's had 3 good years after a difficult period, he said carefully. He's not in crisis. But he was, she said. Difficult period. When exactly? 2816 through 2818, roughly. That's right, when he was in the room at Harwick's dinner, she said. Right when he was most motivated to position himself as an authority by destroying someone else's credibility. She saw Alexander make the connection. He was protecting his own vulnerable position by making the story about the difficult woman who didn't know her place, rather than about the landed men whose estates were in trouble. She said. Yes. She sat back. I need 2 weeks with the county records. I'll arrange access, he said immediately. You don't need to. You need documents that aren't publicly available, he said. I can get them. That's not interfering with your work. That's being the resource I agreed to be. She looked at him. There it was again, that quality. The precision with which he understood the line between helping and overriding. 2 weeks, she said. 2 weeks, he agreed. She was 10 days into the county records when Eleanor came to the estate office for the second time. This visit was different from the first. Eleanor knocked, which Amelia registered as a shift in something, and came in and sat down without waiting to be invited. which was a different kind of shift entirely, the kind that suggested she had moved past a certain formality into something more direct. "Everly is going to say something at the Harrington gathering next week," Eleanor said. "I've heard it from 2 separate sources. He's planning to raise the question of whether Alexander's management of the estate is sound, with the implication that he's being directed by me," Amelia said. "Yes, I know." Eleanor looked at her. "You know. I've been expecting it for 10 days. A pause. "And what are you doing about it?" "I'm building the response," Amelia said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked at the desk, at the papers spread across it, at the specific expression on Amelia's face that was not anxiety and not performance, and not the bright social readiness Eleanor associated with young women attempting to prove themselves. It was the expression of someone in the middle of a calculation, absorbed, precise, completely without self-consciousness. "You enjoy this," Eleanor said. Not accusingly, with something closer to wonder. "I enjoy solving problems," Amelia said. "This is a problem. Most people in your position would be frightened. Most people in my position would be trying to manage their reputation," Amelia said. "I'm not interested in managing my reputation. I'm interested in having a body of work that makes a reputation unnecessary." Eleanor was very still for a moment. "My husband," she said carefully, "was a man of considerable intelligence. I loved him very much, but he could not have sat in this room and said what you just said." She stopped. "I'm not sure I ever could have." Amelia looked at her directly. "What would you have done in my position 30 years ago?" Eleanor's expression changed. The social architecture of it dropped away for just a second, the way it does when someone is asked a question that reaches something they stopped letting themselves think about a long time ago. "I would have married the right man and been grateful and made the best of it," Eleanor said quietly. "Because that was the only option that existed." She paused. "And I did, and it was a good life. But—" She stopped. "But—" Amelia said softly. Eleanor stood. She stood with the precise control of a woman reassembling something she let slip. "The Harrington gathering is on Friday," she said. "I will be attending. I want you to know that." Amelia understood what that meant. "Thank you," she said. Eleanor nodded once and left. Amelia sat alone with the county records and felt the quiet weight of a woman who had just offered, in the only way her lifetime would allow, to stand in a room beside someone she'd been prepared to oppose. She went back to the documents. The Harrington gathering was the social event of that season, which meant approximately 80 people in a house that was designed to display wealth to other wealthy people. Amelia wore deep blue, which Clara had suggested, and which Amelia had agreed to, without particular interest in the aesthetic argument and considerable interest in the practical one. Blue was not a color that disappeared into a room. She arrived with Alexander, which was correct. She arrived with Eleanor, which was notable. She saw the adjustment that ran through the assembled guests at the sight of those 2 women together, the Dowager Duchess and the new one, the old Ravenshire authority and the new presenting a united front that no one had predicted. Everly was there. She had known he would be. She did not go to him. She did not avoid him. She moved through the room the way she had learned to move through difficult spaces, without urgency, without performance, paying exactly the right level of attention to each person she encountered, so that no one could say she was distracted or anxious, and no one could say she was seeking confrontation. She was at the far side of the room, speaking with Lady Harrington about drainage improvements, legitimately, because Lady Harrington had mentioned a genuine problem with her east fields, and Amelia happened to know the solution when she heard Everly's voice rise. Not loudly. He was too careful for loud. But with the particular projection of a man who knows exactly how far his voice needs to carry to reach the audience he's addressing, while maintaining plausible intimacy. "The question I keep hearing," he was saying to 3 men near the fireplace, "is whether Ravenshire is being managed or managed, whether the Duke is directing his affairs or simply presenting them." She heard the shift in the room. That particular collective attention that happens when a gathering senses blood. She set down her glass. She crossed the room. Not quickly, she never moved quickly in rooms like this because speed suggested panic, but with the direct certainty of someone who knows exactly where she's going. She stopped at the edge of the group Everly was addressing. "Lord Everly," she said pleasantly. He turned. His expression managed a very convincing approximation of welcome. "Duchess Ravenshire, I heard what you were just," she said, still pleasant. "I wanted to give you the opportunity to say it directly to me, rather than at an angle." The room around them had gone quiet in a radius of about 10 feet. People were very carefully not looking at this conversation while looking at nothing else. Everly smiled. "I was simply observing." "You were observing whether Alexander is being managed by his wife," Amelia said. "That was the word you used. Managing. I thought it was a reasonable question to address given that I'm present." She paused. "So let me answer it. My husband and I have a documented agreement about the division of authority over Ravenshire's management. He directs the estate's external relationships and strategic direction. I direct the estate's financial and operational management. We made this agreement before our marriage in writing with our solicitors present." She looked at Everly calmly. "So the answer to your question is no, he is not being managed by me. He made a deliberate legal documented decision to allocate authority based on competence. That's not management. That's judgment." She tilted her head slightly. "Was there a specific concern about the estate's outcomes that prompted the question? Because I'd be happy to discuss results." Silence. The specific, weighted kind. Everly looked at her with the expression she had seen before in different rooms on different occasions, the moment when someone realizes that the angle they chose has been removed. "I have no specific concerns," he said. "Wonderful," she said. "Then I imagine there's nothing further to discuss." She turned back to Lady Harrington, who was watching her with an expression that had moved considerably since the beginning of the evening. "I believe we were talking about your East Fields." Lady Harrington blinked, and then very deliberately smiled. "Yes," she said. "We were." Alexander found her an hour later at the edge of the room. He said nothing immediately. He stood beside her for a moment in the particular silence that exists between two people who have been watching the same thing happen from different angles and are now comparing observations. "That was," he started. "Don't," she said. "I don't need it." He looked at her. "I was going to say it was the most precisely executed social correction I've ever watched in person." She considered that. "All right," she said. "You can say that." "Everly is going to find a different angle," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "But now he has to find it without the advantage of surprise. And the people in this room who heard that exchange are going to be measuring whatever he does next against what I just did." She paused. "That's not victory. That's position. Victory comes later." "When?" he said. She thought about the county records sitting on her desk. 10 days of work. 4 more days of cross-referencing she still needed to do. A picture that was becoming clearer every morning. "When I'm ready," she said. He looked at her with the full weight of whatever he was starting to feel, which she could see now in the way he looked at her, even if neither of them had named it. "All right," he said. "I'll wait." And he stood beside her for the rest of the evening, not in front of her and not behind her, but at the same exact level, the way two people stand when they have stopped performing a hierarchy and started inhabiting something more honest than that. Across the room. Eleanor watched them both with an expression that no one who hadn't been paying attention for months would have known how to read. It was not quite pride. It was not quite sorrow. It was the particular feeling of a woman who has watched what was possible for 50 years and is watching at last what it looks like when someone takes it. She raised her glass very slightly. No one noticed. But Amelia, who noticed most things, looked across the room at that small, deliberate gesture and held Eleanor's gaze for exactly 1 second. 1 second was enough. Everly left the Harrington gathering early, which was the most telling thing that happened all evening. He left before supper. He made his excuses to Lady Harrington, who accepted them with the gracious warmth of a woman who had already decided where her opinion was landing, and he was gone before the first course was cleared. His departure did not go unnoticed. In a gathering of 80 people, an early exit by someone who had arrived with visible intent was information. People read it the way they read everything at events like this, quickly, quietly, and with impressive accuracy. By the time Amelia and Alexander were in their carriage home, she already knew how the evening would be discussed tomorrow. "He'll regroup," she said. "I know," Alexander said. "And when he does, I'll be ready," she said. "I have 4 more days of research, and then I'll have what I need." "Tell me what you found," he said. She looked at him, at his face in the half-light of the carriage, at the directness with which he was looking back at her. She had been living alongside this man for 2 months now. She had been watching him in the same careful way she watched everything, and what she had found was consistently the same thing. A man who did what he said he would do, who held the line of their agreement with a steadiness she had not expected and could no longer discount. She told him. She told him what was in the county records, what the pattern suggested, what the 4 more days would likely confirm. She told him all of it without softening and without simplifying, and he listened the entire time with the stillness that was not distance, but attention. When she finished, he said, "He's been operating this way for years." "At least 7, she said. "And no one has been able to document it because the documentation requires knowing where to look," she said, "and knowing what you're looking for, and having the specific knowledge set to recognize it when you find it." She paused. He never worried about it because the people in a position to look at those records didn't have the training to read them. Alexander was quiet for a moment. "Until now," he said. "Until now," she agreed, and the carriage rolled through the November dark, and Amelia's mind was already 4 days ahead, already at the end of the work, already seeing the shape of what came after. The way she always saw things that other people couldn't, not because she was gifted with anything magical, but because she had never once let anyone convince her that the truth was something she wasn't allowed to look for. The 4 days passed, the way the final days of a long calculation always did, with a kind of tightening each hour, bringing the answer closer until she could feel it, the way you feel a word on the tip of your tongue present, and almost there, and not quite landed. On the morning of the 5th day, Amelia set down the last document, sat back in her chair, and looked at what she had built. It was thorough. It was precise. It was the kind of thing that didn't need embellishment or interpretation because it simply was what it was. 7 years of a pattern documented across county records, estate filings, and supplier agreements that told a story. Lord Everley had been very carefully ensuring no one could read. Agricultural yield reports that didn't match declared profits. Land improvement claims that had no corresponding expenditure in the county contractor records. A charitable foundation with Everley's name on it that had received donations from 3 separate business partners in the same years that those partners had received preferential access to Everley's county commission relationships. It wasn't outright theft. It was more sophisticated than that, and therefore more durable as a problem. It was the kind of financial architecture that powerful men built when they were smart enough to know that obvious corruption was risky. A system where every individual piece could be explained away, and the whole could only be understood by someone who had both the skill to read it and the patience to assemble it. She had both. She went to find Alexander. He was not in the estate office. She found him in the stables, which she had learned was where he went when he needed to think without the weight of the house around him. He was not doing anything with the horses, just standing in that way. He had still and deliberate, which she had come to understand as the physical form of his version of her desk work. Different instrument, same function. He heard her approach and turned. She handed him the document folder without preamble. He opened it. He stood in the stable with the folder in his hands and read the way he always read difficult things quickly, completely, without the editorial reactions most people couldn't suppress. She watched him move through each page and felt the particular quality of waiting that had become its own kind of communication between them. She no longer felt the need to explain or persuade while he read. She had learned that he came to her conclusions on his own, and he trusted her enough to get there. When he finished, he looked up. "This is complete," he said. "Yes." He cannot contest any individual piece without drawing attention to the whole structure, she said, which he can't afford anyone to examine. The foundation alone would require him to repay the 3 commission partners for the benefits they received, which means publicly acknowledging that those benefits existed, which means the commission itself comes under scrutiny. She paused. He has no good move. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. When do you want to use it? That depends on what he does next, she said. If he stays quiet and retreats, this goes in a drawer. I don't want to destroy him publicly, that's not the point. She met his eyes. The point is that he stops. He looked at her. You could end his career in the county entirely with this. I know, she said. And you're choosing not to. I'm choosing to hold it in reserve, she said. There's a difference. This is leverage, not a weapon. I'll use it as a weapon only if he forces me to. She paused. Does that seem wrong to you? He shook his head slowly. It seems, he said, like the decision of someone who understands the difference between winning and destroying, which are not the same thing, and most people treat as if they are. She filed that away. The precise way he saw things when he said them like that had the quality of things she wanted to keep somewhere she could find them again. Everly made his move 6 days later, and it was not the move she had expected. She had prepared for a social attack, another gathering, another careful implication designed to reach the right ears. What happened instead was a letter. Delivered to Ravenshire Hall, addressed to Alexander with Everly's seal on it. Alexander brought it to her unopened. Which was, she thought, the most significant thing he had done in the 2 months she had been there. Most men confronted with a formal letter addressed to them from a social rival would read it first and tell their wife about it after. The bringing of it unopened said something about the specific nature of what they had become to each other, which was still a thing she was learning to hold, without either taking it for granted or being frightened by its weight. She opened it. She read it. She read it twice. Then she set it on the desk and looked at it for a moment with the expression she had when something turned out to be both better and worse than she'd anticipated. He's requesting a private meeting, she said. With you, without me. He's framing it as a professional courtesy man-to-man, he says, to discuss concerns about Ravenshire's direction that he'd prefer not to raise in public. Alexander's voice was very quiet. He's trying to remove you from the conversation. He's trying to access you directly and find out how solid the ground is between us, she said. He thinks if he can get to you privately, he can determine whether you're fully committed to our arrangement or whether there's a seam he can push. She paused. He believes every marriage has a seam. Does he? Alexander said. It was not a question. He's worked with men his entire career. He's watched men change their minds when enough pressure is applied through the right channels. He's very good at finding those channels. She turned the letter over in her hands. He doesn't understand that the thing he's looking for isn't there. Alexander crossed to the desk and picked up the letter. He read it himself. When he finished, he set it down with a deliberateness that told her he had decided something. I'm going to write back, he said. I'm going to accept the meeting, and you're going to be there. She looked at him. He won't come if he knows I'll be present. He won't know until he arrives, Alexander said. And there was something in his voice, not coldness exactly, but a very particular quality of resolve that she had seen in him before, in professional contexts, and not until this moment in personal ones. He came into our house by way of an event he organized to damage you. He tried to reach me privately to undermine an agreement I made openly. I'm not going to pretend that warrants polite accommodation. He looked at her steadily. Unless you want me to handle this differently. She thought about it. She thought about it for a real moment, not a performative one. No, she said. I want to be in the room. Then you'll be in the room, he said. Everly arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. He arrived with the ease of a man who believed he was coming to a meeting on favorable terms, and he walked into the drawing room and stopped when he saw Amelia seated at the table. The stop was very brief. He recovered quickly. He always recovered quickly, she had observed, and the smile that replaced his surprise was smooth and practiced. Duchess Ravenshire, he said. I hadn't realized. I know, Amelia said. Please sit down. He sat. He looked at Alexander, who was seated beside Amelia, with no distance between them and no expression of apology. The nature of the seating arrangement was information, and all three of them knew it. You wrote that you had concerns about Ravenshire's direction, Alexander said. "I'd like to hear them directly." Everly adjusted his approach in real time, which was genuinely impressive. He pivoted away from the man-to-man framing with the ease of a man who had learned to never be caught visibly changing his strategy. "I've been hearing things in the county," he said, "from people who are uncertain, about the changes that have been made, about the speed of them, the dismissal of long-standing staff members, the restructuring of tenant agreements." He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable concern. "I simply wanted to express privately that several of the county's most established families are watching these developments with some unease." "Which families?" Amelia asked. He looked at her. "I'd prefer not to name them," she said. "If they have concerns, they can raise them directly. We're quite accessible." She paused. "Or are they concerns you're raising on their behalf without their knowledge?" A beat. Very slight. "I'm speaking in general terms," he said. "Then let me speak in specific ones," Amelia said. She reached into the folder on the table in front of her and removed 3 pages. She placed them on the table facing him. "These are the current financial conditions of the 3 tenant agreements that were restructured. The top line shows what the tenants were paying. The second shows what they're paying now. The third shows the corresponding improvements in land productivity in the 8 weeks since." She paused. "If any of the county's established families have concerns about those numbers, I'd welcome the conversation." Everly looked at the pages. She watched him read them. She watched the slight adjustment that happened when he reached the productivity figures, which were genuinely good, better than she'd expected this early. "These are your projections," he said. "These are documented results," she said. 8 weeks of them." He was quiet. "Lord Everly," Alexander said. His voice was measured and absolutely final. "I want to say something clearly, because I think clarity is preferable to the kind of conversation we've been having in various forms for the past several weeks." He waited until Everly met his eyes. "My wife manages this estate's financial and operational affairs by deliberate design and legal agreement. That arrangement is not a vulnerability in my household. It is not a gap you can access. It is not something I entered into carelessly or can be talked out of through privately expressed concern." He paused. "If you have a genuine professional complaint about Ravenshire, something documented, something specific, I'm willing to hear it. If you don't, then I think this meeting is finished." Everly sat with that. Amelia watched his face go through the calculation. She watched him measure what he had against what was in front of him and arrive at an answer she could read before he said a word. "I have no specific complaint," he said. "Good," Alexander said. Everly stood. He picked up his hat from the table. He looked at Amelia with the expression of a man who is filing something away for later and wants her to know he's filing it. She held his gaze with the pleasant, neutral attention of someone who has everything she needs and knows it. After he was gone, the room was quiet. Then Alexander said very quietly, "He's not finished." "No," she agreed. "But he's changed. He came here thinking he had access that he doesn't have." She paused. "That's significant information for him to carry out of this room." "You're keeping the folder in reserve," he said. "Unless he forces my hand," she said. "I told you, leverage not a weapon." He nodded. He looked at her across the table with the same quality she had been watching develop since the stable. Something that was different from the assessed appreciation he'd arrived at Thornfield with. That had been the recognition of competence. This was something more personal than competence. She noticed it. She had been noticing it for weeks. She was not entirely sure what to do with it. November became December, and December, at Ravenshire Hall, had a specific quality that Amelia hadn't expected. She had expected the estate to be quieter. She had expected the social calendar to thin as the weather closed in. What she had not anticipated was the particular intimacy of a large house in winter. The way the physical compression of cold weather and shortened days created a different kind of proximity between the people living in it. She and Alexander had dinner together every evening. This had been the arrangement since her arrival, but it had changed in character. The early dinners had been professional. Good professional, genuinely useful, but organized around the work, the way her desk was organized around the accounts. What they were now was harder to categorize. They still talked about the work. The work was always there, always present, because that was who they both were. But there were spaces in the conversation now that hadn't been there before. Pauses that weren't about thinking. Moments when one of them said something that had nothing to do with Ravenshire and everything to do with the person saying it. She told him about Thornfield one evening. Not the accounts, he knew the accounts, but what it had been like to be there. The specific quality of the loneliness. The mornings when the problem in front of her was the only thing that made the day feel structured. The letter from her father asking about the property's progress without asking about her. She had not intended to tell him all of that. It came out in pieces over the course of what was supposed to be a conversation about winter crop planning, and she became aware somewhere in the middle of it that she had said more to this man in one evening than she had said to most people in a year. I didn't respond with the soft, rounded comfort that some people deployed when you said difficult things. He responded with attention, the precise receiving quality of attention that she had recognized in him since the beginning, and that she realized now was the thing she trusted most about him. When she finished, he said, "Your father wrote to you about the property." "Every quarter," she said, "and never about you." "No." I was quiet for a moment. "My father," he said slowly, "had a habit of walking into a room where I was working and rearranging things. Not out of malice. He simply didn't consider that I had organized them intentionally." He paused. "When I was 17, I finally asked him to stop. He looked at me as if I had said something in a foreign language." He stopped. He never understood that what I did with my own space was not available for his preferences. She looked at him. "He didn't see you," she said. "He saw me," Alexander said. "He saw his idea of me, which is not the same thing." The distinction landed somewhere specific. "No," she said. "It isn't." They sat for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have just said something true to each other and don't need to do anything with it except let it settle. The first week of December brought a request from Amelia's mother. She had been writing to her mother every 2 weeks since her marriage. Careful letters, not warm exactly, but not cold, the kind of letters you write to someone you love in a complicated way. Her mother's letters in return had the quality of someone adjusting in real time to a situation. She hadn't predicted each one slightly less certain than the one before, that things had gone wrong. This letter was different. Her mother wrote that Amelia's father was unwell. Not critically, she used the word unwell carefully, the way she used every word carefully, but Amelia read through the carefulness to the thing underneath it, which was that he was more than unwell, and she was frightened, and she did not know how to ask her daughter for anything, because she had spent too many years managing Amelia out of situations rather than inviting her in. Amelia read the letter at her desk in the morning before Alexander was up, and sat with it for a long time. Then she went to find him. He was in the small study off the library, which she had learned was where he went first thing in the morning when he had something he was working through. She knocked, which she always did, which was one of the small negotiations of space they had conducted without ever explicitly discussing. "Come in," he said. She came in. She handed him the letter. He read it. He read it once, which was enough for him with things like this. "Go," he said before she had said anything. "The accounts are organized and functional and can wait 2 weeks," he said. "Clara can hold what needs to be held. I can manage anything urgent." He looked at her steadily. "Your father is ill. Go." She stood there for a moment with the letter in her hand, and something happening in her chest that was not the clean, manageable quality of the work feeling, but the messier, more resistant feeling of something personal being offered without terms attached. "I was going to ask," she said. "I wasn't going to simply go." "I know," he said, "and I'm telling you that you don't need to ask." He paused. "This is not the estate, Amelia. This is your family. You don't submit a request." She looked at him. She looked at him for longer than she usually looked at anything that wasn't an accounts page. "I'll be back by the 20th, she said. "Be back when it's right," he said. She left Ravenshire Hall the next morning, and somewhere on the road, south with the gray December fields moving past the carriage window, she started trying to identify what exactly had shifted in her chest when he looked at her and said, This is your family without a single qualifier attached. She didn't have the word for it yet. She wasn't afraid of that. She was good at waiting for the right answer. Her father was worse than her mother's letter had prepared her for. I was not dying, not immediately, but illness had done what time and circumstance hadn't quite managed. It had made him smaller. She sat beside his bed the first evening and saw him clearly for the first time in years. Not as the man she had spent her childhood trying to make proud, and her adulthood trying not to need the approval of, but as a man who was frightened and tired, and had built a life around a set of values that had cost him things he hadn't entirely reckoned with. He looked at her. The title, the marriage, the thing she had become. It was all there in the room between them, and he didn't know what to do with any of it. "You look well," he said. It was inadequate, and they both knew it. "I am well," she said. A silence. "Ravenshire," he said. "I've been hearing things." "Good things or bad things?" she asked. "Both," he admitted. "Good things about the estate. Complicated things about—" He stopped. "About me," she said. "About the way I do it. About the fact that you do it at all," he said. And there it was, the old argument, the one she had spent her life having in various forms, resurfacing in a sick room, with none of the social dressing it usually wore. Amelia, a duchess managing accounts. "A duchess doing exactly what she is capable of doing," she said without heat, with the full agreement of her husband and documented legal authority. He was quiet. "Father," she said, and her voice was quieter now because he was sick and she was not cruel, and there were things she had wanted to say for years that she had decided before she walked in the door she was going to say today, because there might not be another good opportunity, and she was not a woman who postponed important things indefinitely. "I need you to understand something. Not forgive me for something, not agree with something. Understand." He looked at her. "I was not sent away to Thornfield as a punishment," she said. "I know it was meant as one or something close to it. But what happened at Thornfield was that I found out what I was capable of doing when no one was telling me I was doing it wrong. And that changed everything." She paused. "The woman you sent away and the woman who married a duke are the same person. The only thing that changed is that someone finally saw her." I didn't speak for a long moment. She watched the working of it on his face, not just the thing she'd said, but the years behind it, the dinner party, and the carriage ride home, and the study in the morning, and the letter that asked about the property and not about her. "I did not know how to," he started. "I know," she said. "I know you didn't." She reached over and put her hand over his, which was something she hadn't done in years, and which she did now without calculation. "I'm not asking you to have done it differently. I'm telling you it's all right now." He looked at her hand on his. He looked at her face. "He treats you well," he said. Ravenshire. She thought about a man who had brought her a letter unopened, who had said, "This is your family, you don't submit a request," who read difficult things without performing the reading and said true things without performing the truth. "He treats me like someone worth being honest with," she said, "which is the most important thing." Her father closed his eyes. He kept her hand in his. "That's more than most people get," he said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "I know." She was back at Ravenshire by the 17th, 3 days earlier than she'd said. Her father was stable, not recovered, but steady, and her mother had the look of a woman who has been given back a handhold she wasn't sure she'd find. Alexander was in the estate office when she arrived. He heard the carriage and came out, which told her he had been listening for it, which told her something she filed away for later. She was barely through the door when he said, "Your father." "Stable," she said. "Improving, actually. He has a very strong opinion about not dying inconveniently." She set down her bag. "I'm back earlier than I planned." "I see that," he said. He was looking at her in a way she had become familiar with, the direct measuring look that was not invasive but was very thorough. "I'm fine," she said. "I didn't ask," he said. "You were about to." "I was going to wait until you'd had tea," he said. Clara, appearing from somewhere with the uncanny timing she had developed into an art form, arrived with a tray. Amelia sat. Alexander sat across from her. The estate office had the particular quiet of a room that had been waiting for the person who organized it to come back. She told him about her father. Not everything, some of it was still too fresh to be handed over, but enough. The sick room, the conversation, the way her father had held her hand and she had let him. Alexander listened the entire time without filling the silences she left between things. When she finished, he said, "He sees it now, what you are." "Some of it," she said. "As much as he can." "That's something." "It's more than I expected," she said honestly. She looked at her tea. "I didn't expect to feel, I don't know, lighter." She looked up. "That's the wrong word." "What's the right word?" She thought about it. "Like something I'd been carrying had been set down," she said. "Not resolved, just put in a different place." He looked at her. She had become over these weeks increasingly aware of the specific quality of the way he looked at her, which had changed since the beginning, in a way she could now see clearly. It had started as assessment. It had moved through something like respect. What it was now was something she hadn't named yet, but that she felt in the particular attention of it, the way it landed differently than any other kind of attention she'd received in her life. "Amelia," he said. "Yes," she said, which was not exactly the right response to someone saying your name, but which was what came out. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I'm going to tell you the way I'd want you to tell me something directly, without softening it for palatability." She set down her cup. "Then tell me." He held her gaze. "Somewhere in the past 2 months," he said, "the nature of what I feel about you changed. I'm not sure exactly when. I've been trying to identify the moment, and I can't find it because it wasn't a moment. It was gradual, which is strange for me because most things I feel are identifiable from the beginning." He paused. "I came to Thornfield because I needed your intelligence. What I didn't anticipate was that your intelligence is not separable from who you are. The way you move through problems, the way you hold your ground, the way you care about Mrs. Aldridge's preserves, and don't know what to do with the fact that you care, so you go back to your desk." He stopped. "I didn't fall in love with a skill set. I fell in love with a person." The room was very quiet. She had known on some level for weeks. She had known the way you know things you're not quite ready to hold, with a kind of peripheral awareness that kept it in sight without forcing it into full examination. Hearing it said directly in the plain declarative way, he said everything landed differently than she had expected. She looked at him. She looked at this man who had driven through October weather to sit across from her at a desk in Thornfield, who had agreed to conditions that should have been standard, who had read her father's letter, unopened, and told her without a single qualifier that her family was not a request she needed to submit. She had spent her entire life being valued for what she could do. She had been measured against her usefulness, her output, her ability to fix what other people had broken. She had not had a framework for being valued for the self that did the fixing. "I've been trying to determine," she said slowly, "whether what I feel about you is gratitude for being seen or something independent of the seeing." She paused. "I couldn't figure it out for a long time, because the two things felt the same. Someone finally seeing you clearly, that can feel like love, when it might just be relief." "And now," he said. "Now," she said, "I've been away for 2 weeks, and for most of those 2 weeks I was thinking about coming back. Not to Ravenshire." She held his gaze. "To this room, to this desk, to the person who left the door open and the tea on the corner, and who handed me an unopened letter, because he understood without being told that it was mine." He said nothing. He was watching her with the full quality of his attention, which was the most complete thing she had ever been given by another person. "I think it's independent," she said, "of the seeing. It started because you saw me, but it's not about the seeing anymore. It's about you." She paused. "Specifically." The silence between them now was different from every other silence they had shared. It had a warmth in it that she felt rather than processed, which was unusual and not unpleasant. He reached across the desk and put his hand over hers. The same gesture she had used with her father, but different in every way that mattered. She turned her hand and held his. "I'm not good at this part," she said. "The personal part. I have a much better track record with the professional." "I know," he said. I'll probably retreat to the accounts when it becomes overwhelming. I know that too, he said. You're not concerned. I know where to find you, he said. And I know that when you come back from the accounts, what you bring with you is worth waiting for. She looked at him for a long moment. At the particular face of a man who had stopped performing the distance he'd initially kept, who was sitting across a desk in December, with his hand over hers, and his eyes completely clear. All right, she said. It was not a grand declaration. It was not the kind of thing that poets wrote about. But it was the truth delivered directly without softening, which was the language they both spoke. It was more than enough. That evening, Eleanor came to the small sitting room where Amelia was writing letters. Eleanor had been different since the Harrington gathering. Amelia couldn't point to a single change. It was cumulative, the way Eleanor's changes always were. A series of small adjustments that added up to a different posture. She knocked now. She sat now, rather than positioning herself. She had twice asked Amelia questions about the estate accounts that she had then actually listened to the answers to which was the most significant change of all. She came in and sat and looked at Amelia with the expression Amelia had started to recognize as Eleanor's version of direct. You came back early, Eleanor said. My father stabilized, Amelia said. How was it being home? Amelia set down her pen. She considered the question, which from Eleanor was a real question. Clarifying, she said finally, in ways I hadn't expected. Eleanor nodded. She looked at her hands for a moment. My son, she said, and then stopped, which was unusual for Eleanor, who did not typically stop mid-sentence. Yes, Amelia said. He is not? Eleanor tried again. He is not an easy man to know, she said. He is not an easy man to love either. He keeps things in. He works through things alone. He has never been comfortable receiving care. He doesn't know what to do with it, which means he gives it in odd ways through actions rather than words through the quality of his attention. She paused. Most people miss it entirely. Amelia looked at her. I know, she said. Eleanor looked back at her, and in Eleanor's face was something that had been building for months through resistance and adjustment, and a sickroom conversation she hadn't been present for, but could somehow see the effects of. Something that was finally carefully relinquishing its grip on the formality she'd worn like armor. Good, Eleanor said. I'm glad. She stood. She moved toward the door. She stopped. Amelia, she said. The first name. The first time without a title or a formal address. Yes, Amelia said. You're good for him, Eleanor said. And I believe he is. I believe he will be good for you. She paused. I wanted to say it plainly since that appears to be how things are done in this house now. She left. Amelia sat alone in the sitting room with the letter she'd been writing and the fire and the particular quality of a December evening at Ravenshire that had started to feel like something she understood from the inside. She had arrived at this house 2 months ago with an accounts box and a leather folder and a set of conditions she'd negotiated like a treaty. What she was building here was something the accounts couldn't measure and the conditions hadn't covered. Something she hadn't planned for and couldn't have because it was the kind of thing that only grew in the space between a plan and the life that happens inside it. She picked up her pen. She finished the letter. And down the hall in the estate office where the accounts were clean and the staff had stopped waiting for her to leave, and the Ravenshire that had been suffocating under years of mismanagement was slowly, steadily learning to breathe again. Alexander sat with his own work and the particular quality of a man who had said a true thing and had it received truly, which was rarer than anything wealth or title could arrange, and which he intended with everything he had to deserve. The letter from Lord Everley arrived on a Monday morning in January, and it was not addressed to Alexander. It was addressed to Amelia. She saw her name on the outside of it and understood immediately that something had changed in his calculation. A man who had spent months trying to remove her from the conversation was now writing to her directly, which meant one of two things: he had decided to attempt a different kind of access, or he had run out of other options. She opened it at her desk, before Alexander was down, before Clara had finished with the morning fire in the cold early light that January pushed through the windows of the estate office. It was 3 paragraphs. Precise, careful, stripped of the social ornamentation he usually deployed. He wrote that he had become aware of certain research she had conducted into his estate's records. He wrote that he believed a private conversation between them, without intermediaries, would be mutually beneficial. He wrote that he was prepared to discuss terms. She read it twice. She set it down. She sat with her hands flat on the desk and her eyes on the middle distance, and thought about what terms meant from a man in his position. He knew she had it. He didn't know exactly what she had, but he knew enough to know it was enough. Someone in the county records office had talked not maliciously probably, but with the casual indiscretion of someone who hadn't understood what they were enabling. Everly had sources everywhere. That was part of how he had operated for so long without consequence. The question was what he intended to offer. Alexander came in at 7:30 and found her at her desk with the letter in front of her, and the expression he had learned to read as deep calculation, rather than distress, though from the outside, the two looked similar. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. He looked up. Terms, he said. That's the word he used. He wants to negotiate. He wants to find out what I'll take to make this go away, she said. Which tells me something important. That he's more exposed than we thought, Alexander said. That he's more exposed than he thought, she corrected. He built that system over 7 years, and no one ever looked at it hard enough to understand it. Now someone has, and he doesn't know exactly what I've found. So he's coming to the table blind, which means whatever he offers is going to be higher than it needs to be, because he's pricing in uncertainty. She paused. I want to meet with him. Alexander looked at her steadily. Alone. Yes, she said. I know you're going to object to that. I'm not going to object, he said. I'm going to tell you my concern, and then let you decide. He paused. He specifically excluded intermediaries. He's going to try to use the private setting to say things that he can deny having said if this goes badly. He's very practiced at that. I know, she said. I'm practiced at documentation. I was quiet for a moment. What are you actually trying to achieve with this meeting? She had been thinking about that since she read the first line of the letter. The answer had come to her slowly, the way real answers did not, with the clean snap of a calculation resolving, but with the gradual accumulation of a truth she'd been approaching for a while. I don't want his destruction, she said. I've said that from the beginning. What I want is for him to stop, and I want him to stop in a way that he can't reverse when he decides he's comfortable again. She looked at Alexander. The only thing that accomplishes that is an agreement where he has as much to lose from breaking it as I do from him continuing. She paused. I need him to give me something. And you think he will? I think he's frightened enough to, she said, which is the only window this kind of conversation ever has. She met Everly at a neutral location, a solicitor's office in the county seat, which had been her counter-proposal to his suggestion of his private study, because she was not going to meet a man like Everly on ground he controlled. He had accepted the location with the slight hesitation of someone recalibrating, which told her the solicitor's office had been the right choice. She arrived first. She always arrived first when it mattered. He came in 12 minutes later and sat across from her at a table that had no desk between them, which she had also arranged deliberately. A desk created a professional frame. No desk was a different kind of conversation. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has decided to be disarming and is hoping she won't notice the effort. Duchess Ravenshire, he said. Lord Everly, she said. You wrote that you wanted to discuss terms. I'm here to listen. He had prepared something. She could tell from the first sentence it had the quality of rehearsed language, not written out, but shaped through repetition. He spoke about misunderstandings. He spoke about the complexity of long-term estate management and the impossibility of clean records over decades. He spoke about goodwill and the county's collective interest in stability. She let him finish. Then she said, Lord Everly, I have 7 years of documented pattern across 4 record sets that demonstrates a systematic use of your county commission position to benefit business partners who provided reciprocal financial support to your personal charitable foundation. She paused. I'm not interested in discussing the complexity of estate management. I'm interested in what you're prepared to offer in exchange for that documentation remaining private. The rehearsed quality left his face. What replaced it was something more real, not panic, because he was too controlled for panic, but the specific alertness of a man who has just understood the precise dimensions of the room he's in. "What do you want?" he said. "Three things," she said. "First, you will publicly retract in whatever social setting is most visible the implication you made at the Carmichael dinner and the Harrington gathering about the management of Ravenshire Hall. Not an apology, a correction. You will state that you were mistaken." He was very still. "That will be uncomfortable," she said. "Yes. Second, you will cease any involvement, direct or indirect, in county commission decisions that affect Ravenshire's tenants or land assessments. Completely. If there is a vote that touches our interests, you recuse yourself and document the recusal." He looked at her. "And the third, the three families from whom your agent was collecting double rents," she said, "before he came to Ravenshire. I have reason to believe similar arrangements existed on 2 other estates in this county. I want those families identified and compensated, and I want it done through a private settlement that I will draft and you will fund." She met his eyes. "Not because it helps me, because it's owed." The room was quiet. She watched him process it. She watched him run the calculation, what she was asking, against what she had, what the exposure would cost him, against what compliance would cost him. She had set the terms carefully, deliberately, not asking for anything that would require his public humiliation, beyond the single retraction, because humiliated men found ways to become dangerous again, and she wanted this to be finished, not postponed. "You could have destroyed me," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you?" She looked at him. "Because destroying you doesn't help the people you've been taking advantage of for 7 years, she said. "Compensating them does. And because I'm not interested in being the person who ends careers. I'm interested in being the person who makes certain things stop." She paused. "This stops. Today. On these terms." He sat with it for a long moment. "I'll need my solicitor to review." "Of course," she said. She reached into her folder and removed a single clean page. "I've drafted the agreement. Your solicitor can review it. My solicitor has already approved the language. I'll need a signed copy by Friday." She slid it across the table. He looked at it. He looked at her, and in his expression was something she had not expected and that landed with more weight than any of the other things in the room. It was recognition. The same recognition she had seen in Henley's face when he understood what he was dealing with, but without Henley's outrage. Something quieter. Something closer to the recognition of a man who has finally encountered the correct level of force for the problem he is. He picked up the page. "Friday," he said. "Friday," she said. The signed agreement arrived Thursday afternoon, a day early, which she chose to interpret not as eagerness, but as the decision of a man who wanted it finished. She read every word, confirmed that nothing had been altered from the draft, and filed it in the leather folder that had been growing steadily thicker since her first week at Ravenshire. She told Alexander that evening. All of it. The meeting, the terms, the agreement, the single retraction that Everly had now committed to delivering at the next county gathering in February. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The families, the compensation. He'll fund it through the solicitor. I'll draft the settlement amounts based on the documentation I have." She paused. "It's not everything they're owed. Some of what was taken can't be calculated accurately at this remove. But it's something real." "You negotiated that specifically," he said, "as one of the 3 terms." "It mattered more than the retraction," she said. "Honestly, the retraction is useful to Ravenshire. The compensation is useful to them." Howe was looking at her with the full weight of whatever he felt, which by now she had stopped trying to inventory and simply accepted as present and directed at her and genuine. "I need to tell you something," he said. "You told me something important last month," she said. "I'm still. This is different," he said. "Or rather, it's connected, but it's not the same." He paused. "I've been watching you manage this situation with Everly for 2 months. And I've been watching you manage Ravenshire for 4, and I have been aware throughout of the difference between observing competence and observing a person. I told you last month what I felt." He stopped. What I haven't told you is that every day since then, it's been confirmed." She looked at him. "You don't need me to say it," he said. "I know that. You are not a woman who requires external validation of things she already knows." He paused. "But I find I need to say it anyway, because it's true, and I don't want to be the kind of person who doesn't say true things because they're not required." "Then say it," she said. "You are the most complete person I have ever known," he said. "And I mean that precisely. Not the most intelligent though you are. Not the most capable though you are that too. Complete. You don't perform different parts of yourself in different rooms. You don't adjust who you are for what the situation requires. You are the same person at Mrs. Aldridge's kitchen table, and at Everly's negotiation, and at your father's bedside." He held her gaze. "I did not know that was possible before I met you. I didn't have evidence of it. And now I do, and it has changed what I understand to be true about what people can be." She sat with that. She was not. She thought someone who was easily undone by words. She dealt in words professionally. She understood their architecture, their weight, the gap between what they said and what they meant. She knew when language was being used precisely and when it was being used decoratively. This was precise. "I need to tell you something too," she said. "I've been waiting until I was sure." "Are you sure?" he said. "I'm sure," she said. "I spent 3 years at Thornfield learning what it felt like to work at full capacity. To be completely what I am, without apologizing or adjusting or translating myself into something more acceptable." She paused. "Being at Ravenshire feels like that. Being with you feels like that. Not because you don't challenge me, you do, and I'm glad of it, but because you challenge me as a complete person, not as a skill set that happens to have a woman attached to it." She stopped. "I love you. That's what I've been waiting to be sure of. That it was that, and not something smaller." The room held the particular quality of a moment that knows it is a moment. He reached across the desk and took her hand, the way he had in December, and she held it the way she had then, and the gesture was the same, but the weight of it was entirely different, because this time neither of them was finding their footing. This time they were both standing on solid ground. "We're going to be fine," he said. "We're going to be better than fine," she said. "We have excellent documentation." He did something she had seen only rarely in the 4 months she had known him. He laughed. A real laugh, not the almost smile, not the quality that briefly replaced stillness, but an actual unguarded, completely unperformed laugh. She found she liked it very much. February came, and Everly delivered his retraction at the Pemberton gathering with the precise, uncomfortable sincerity of a man honoring an agreement he'd signed in a solicitor's office. He said that he had been mistaken in implications he had made regarding the management of Ravenshire Hall, that Duchess Ravenshire's authority over the estate's operations was a deliberate and highly effective arrangement, and that the estate's recent results spoke for themselves. The room received it with the particular charged attention of a gathering that has been waiting for something to resolve and is now watching it do so. Amelia stood across the room and listened, and felt nothing dramatic. Not triumph. Triumph was what you felt when you'd been trying to beat something. She had never been trying to beat Everly. She had been trying to stop him, and he had stopped, and the feeling that accompanied the end of a problem correctly solved was quieter than triumph. More like the moment when the last number in a long calculation settles into place. Clean. Final. Right. Lady Harrington found her afterward. She was a perceptive woman. Lady Harrington, who had been paying attention since the dinner where Amelia had redirected a conversation in 4 sentences. "You managed that beautifully," she said. Not loudly, just to Amelia. "I managed it correctly," Amelia said. "Those aren't always the same thing," Lady Harrington said. "In my experience, they very rarely are." She looked at Amelia with the straightforward appreciation of a woman who has been in society long enough to know exactly how rare a thing she is looking at. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I have never seen anyone come into this county and reorder it so thoroughly in 4 months." "I wasn't trying to reorder it," Amelia said. "I know," Lady Harrington said. "That's why it worked." Spring came to Ravenshire. The way it comes to places that have been through hard winters with an excess of intention, as if the land were correcting for lost time. The fields that had been managed under the new tenant agreements were visibly different from the previous spring. Gideon Marsh, who had come from Thornfield for a 3-day visit to consult on drainage methodology and had been quietly installed as a Ravenshire consultant on small estate management, which Amelia had proposed and Alexander had approved in the same conversation, walked the east fields and said without his usual understatement, "This is something. It's the correct drainage combined with the revised crop rotation I outlined in the December memo," Amelia said. "I know what it is," Gideon said. "I'm saying it's something. You're allowed to be pleased." She was pleased. She was also already thinking about the north fields, which had different soil composition and required a modified approach, and the supplier contract renewal coming in April, and the fact that the accounts office now had 2 junior staff who were competent and loyal and needed a formal training structure she hadn't yet had time to build. "You never stop," Gideon observed. "I stop," she said. "I stop at dinner, and on Sundays." "Do you?" She thought about Sunday evenings. She and Alexander had developed the habit, neither of them had proposed it. It had simply accumulated into a habit of spending Sunday evenings in the library without work. Not without conversation, which was its own kind of thinking, but without the accounts, without the correspondence, without the folder. Just the two of them and Eleanor, who had begun joining them a month ago, with the studied casualness of a woman who has decided she would like to belong to something, and is going to accomplish this by simply appearing until belonging becomes fact. "Yes," she said, "I stop on Sundays." Gideon looked at her. He had known her for 3 years, which was long enough to know what she looked like when she was not entirely fine, and long enough to know what she looked like when she was entirely fine in a way she hadn't been when he first met her. "Good," he said simply, and turned back to the fields. Her father came to Ravenshire in April. He had recovered well enough to travel, which her mother's letter had described with the particular relief of someone who had not entirely believed recovery was coming. He arrived with her mother and her younger brother Thomas, who was 20 and had his sister's eyes and their father's tendency toward careful social navigation, and who looked at Ravenshire Hall with an expression that Amelia recognized as the specific overwhelm of someone encountering something larger than they had fully prepared for. Her father walked through the estate office on the first morning. He walked slowly, still. The illness had done that, and he looked at the organized desk and the filing system and the accounts stacked in their precise order and the notation system she had developed that was now copied in the accounts office downstairs, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You built this." "I organized what was here," she said. The building was already done. "Amelia," he said. She looked at him. "You built this," he said again. He wasn't talking about the desk. She understood what he was saying. She had understood her father better since December, since the sick room, since the conversation where she had said, "I'm not asking you to have done it differently," and meant it. Understanding him didn't erase the years before, but it changed the weight they carried. They were history now, not an ongoing condition. "I did," she said. "With help. With good help." He nodded slowly. He looked around the room one more time. "I was wrong," he said. "About what you were. About what it meant." He paused. "I told you that you were too clever to stay. I said it like it was a failing." "I know," she said. "It wasn't," he said. "It never was." She crossed the room and stood beside him and looked at the desk with him. The way you look at something when you're trying to see it through someone else's eyes. What he saw, she thought, was probably not what she saw. She saw the work still left to do the Northfields and the training structure and the April contracts. He saw what had already happened. Maybe that was the correct division. People who had stood at the beginning of a thing and people who had done the thing could legitimately see different parts of it. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it." He put his arm around her the way he had when she was very small before the dinner parties and the carriage rides and the things that accumulate between parents and children who love each other and don't always know how. She let him. The county gathering in May was different from every one that had come before it. Not because anything dramatic happened. Nothing dramatic happened. That was precisely the point. Amelia and Alexander arrived together, and the room received them the way rooms receive things they have accepted. Not without interest. There was still interest, would always be interest. She was not naive about that, but without the specific, edged quality of interest that carries judgment in its teeth. The conversations she moved through that evening were the conversations of someone who had been incorporated. Women asked her genuine questions about estate management and listened to the genuine answers. Men who had initially addressed everything to Alexander, while technically speaking to her, now addressed her directly, which was not a courtesy extended, but a habit formed by months of evidence that she was the correct person to address. Lady Harrington introduced her to a woman named Mrs. Forsyth, newly arrived in the county from London, recently widowed, who was navigating an estate she had inherited and did not know how to manage. She watched Amelia for several minutes before saying quietly, "I've heard about you." "I imagine you have," Amelia said. "Is it true that you manage the Ravenshire accounts entirely?" "Entirely," Amelia said. "And that the estate has improved significantly since you took over." "The documentation is available," Amelia said. "If you'd like to see it, I'm happy to arrange access." Mrs. Forsyth looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has been told there is no help available and has just found evidence to the contrary. "How did you learn," she said, "to do all of it?" Amelia thought about this, about the answer that was both true and useful, rather than the answer that was merely flattering or inspirational. "I was sent away," she said, "to a failing property, with no help and no support, and an expectation that I would fail." She paused. "I didn't fail. And what I learned there, not from teachers, but from the work itself, is what I use here." She met Mrs. Forsyth's eyes. "The work teaches you if you let it. The key is not letting anyone convince you that you're not allowed to learn." Mrs. Forsyth was quiet for a moment. "Would you—" she started, then stopped. "Yes," Amelia said. "Come to Ravenshire. Bring your accounts. We'll go through them together." The relief on Mrs. Forsyth's face was so complete and so unguarded that it hit somewhere in Amelia's chest with more force than most professional victories. She thought about Clara, who had grown from a household assistant into the person who now managed Ravenshire's domestic operations with the same direct competence she had first shown in Thornfield. She thought about the two junior accounts staff she was training, a young man and a young woman, both of whom were quick, and neither of whom had the background that anyone would traditionally consider adequate, and both of whom were developing right in front of her into something useful and real. She thought about Mrs. Aldridge's preserves on the shelf in her office, which she had kept there, not as a decoration, but as a reminder. She thought about what it meant to be good at something, in a world that had spent a long time telling you that being good at things was not sufficient reason to be allowed to do them. It was sufficient reason. It had always been sufficient reason. She had just needed enough time and enough space to prove it to anyone who hadn't understood. Eleanor found her that evening after the gathering in the library, where the Sunday evenings had become a ritual. Alexander was there too, reading, which was what he did when the week had required a great deal of talking. Eleanor sat in the chair she had claimed 3 months ago with the studied casualness of someone accomplishing occupation by persistence. "Mrs. Forsyth," Eleanor said. "Yes," Amelia said. "She's going to come to you." "I know. And others will follow," Eleanor said. "After her. You understand that." Amelia looked at her. "Is that a concern?" "It's an observation," Eleanor said. And then more quietly, "When I was 28, there was a woman in this county, an older woman, perhaps 50, who managed her late husband's estate with a capability that everyone acknowledged and no one discussed, because discussing it would have required acknowledging what it meant." She paused. "I wanted to ask her questions. I never did. I didn't think I was allowed." She looked at Amelia. "You're going to be that woman for Mrs. Forsyth, and whoever comes after her." "I'm going to be myself," Amelia said. "And if that helps someone else—" "It already has," Eleanor said simply. "I want you to know that." The room was quiet. The fire, the books, the three of them which had become the specific combination of a Sunday evening at Ravenshire, the Dowager Duchess, and the Duke, and the woman who had arrived in autumn with an accounts box and a set of conditions, and had built something that none of the three of them had entirely predicted. Alexander looked up from his book. He looked at Amelia the way he looked at her when he wasn't being careful about it, with the complete unguarded quality that she had been the recipient of for months, and that she still was not entirely accustomed to, because a whole life of being looked at obliquely did not prepare you for being looked at directly by someone who meant it. "Good day," he said. "Good day," she said. In the years that followed, the things that grew at Ravenshire were not always the things anyone had predicted. The accounts grew obviously. The estate's financial condition moved from modest stability to genuine prosperity over 3 years. Amelia's system, documented, refined, adjusted by 2 years of testing, became the operational framework for the estate in a form that would outlast any single person's attention. She trained people who trained other people. That was how you made something durable. But other things grew too. Mrs. Forsyth came in June as promised and left with 4 weeks of work done and a framework for doing the rest. She sent 2 letters afterward, both of which were professional but carried at the edges the particular warmth of someone who has been given a tool they had not known existed. 6 months later, she introduced Amelia to a woman she had met through a London connection, similarly situated, similarly without resources. This woman came too. Then another. It did not become a formal thing. Amelia did not organize it, did not name it, did not establish it with the deliberate architecture she used for everything else. It grew the way things grow when they answer a need so obviously that the only question is why no one met it earlier organically, without announcement, through the particular propagation of word of mouth among women who had found what they needed and wanted other women to find it too. Clara, by the end of the 3rd year, was running Ravenshire's domestic operations completely on her own and had, at Amelia's suggestion, and with the legal paperwork Amelia drafted and Alexander signed, been given a formal title and a formal salary to match the formal responsibility she had been carrying for 18 months. When Clara's mother visited and asked what she did, Clara said, "I manage the household of Ravenshire Hall," and said it without any qualifying language, which was the thing Amelia noticed, and which was, she thought, the most concrete evidence that something had genuinely changed here. Her father's health improved enough that he came to Ravenshire twice more in the following years. He and Alexander developed a relationship that Amelia observed with something that was not quite amusement and not quite relief, but some combination of both. 2 careful men who were precise about everything, who had loved the same woman in entirely different ways, finding the particular respect of people who understand the same difficult thing about the same difficult person. At one of these visits, her father sat with Alexander in the library after dinner, while Amelia was in the estate office, finishing something she had promised herself she would finish before morning, and said she heard about this later from Alexander, who told her because he had understood that she needed to know, "I should have seen her earlier." And Alexander had said, "You see her now, that's not nothing." Her father had been quiet for a long moment and then said, "No, it's not nothing." 5 years after a black carriage arrived at Thornfield, in an October storm. Amelia Whitmore Ravenshire stood in the east fields of Ravenshire Hall, with Gideon Marsh and the 2 junior account staff, now senior, now fully capable, now training the 2 people below them with the same directness she had trained them, and looked at what a decade of neglect corrected by 4 years of consistent, careful, well-documented work had produced. It was not dramatic. Fields never looked dramatic when what they were doing was simply being healthy. But she had learned years ago that the absence of drama was its own kind of evidence. Things that were dramatic were things in crisis. Things that were simply working steadily without requiring emergency intervention. Those were the things that had been built correctly. Gideon said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "When I met you at Thornfield, you were going through accounts that were designed to be impossible to read." "Yes," she said. "And now look at this," he said. She looked. She looked at the fields and the people in them, and the management structure behind them, and the documentation underneath all of it, and the woman who had trained the people who built the structure, who would train the people who came after. And she felt something that was not pride. Exactly. Pride was too self-referential for what she felt, too contained to a single person. What she felt was something more like rightness. The rightness of a thing that had been built in the right way by the right people for the right reasons. Alexander found her there. He had a way of finding her which she had noticed early and never commented on, because there was nothing to say about it except that it was true. He came across the field with the directness of someone who knows exactly where they're going, and stood beside her and looked at what she was looking at. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you remember what you told me at the solicitor's office when I asked you what you wanted?" "I said I wanted documented authority," she said, "in writing." "Before that," he said, "you said I want to be introduced as myself, Amelia Whitmore, who manages this estate. My name and my work are the same thing." She looked at him. "I want you to know," he said, "that I understood what you meant at the time, but I understand it better now." He paused. "Your name and your work are not the same thing because you want credit. They're the same thing because you built something real, and real things have the name of the person who built them." She held his gaze for a long moment. This man she had agreed to marry in a solicitor's office with a folder of conditions. This man who had read letters unopened and driven through October storms, and laughed in a way that was completely unguarded, and said true things without performing the truth. "We built it," she said. "You built it," he said. "I made space for it. There's a difference, and you know it." She knew it. She did not argue with things she knew. He took her hand. She held it with the ease of something practiced and natural, and no longer requiring any attention, the ease of something that had become simply true. The people who had once said "you're too clever to stay" said other things now, not loudly, not with apology, not with the grand self-correction of people who understood the full scope of what they had dismissed. People like that rarely did. But in the spaces between the public things in the county meetings and the social gatherings and the conversations that happened in the offices and kitchens and fields of a community that had slowly reorganized itself around a new understanding of what competence looked like and who was allowed to have it, the things they said were different. They said Ravenshire is extraordinary. "Have you seen what they've done with the tenant agreements?" They said I heard Duchess Ravenshire helped Mrs. Forsyth. Yes, entirely. Spent 3 weeks going through her accounts. No charge. They said sometimes in the very quiet spaces. She was right, you know. About Harwick. She was right the whole time. And in the village that bordered the Ravenshire lands, where Mrs. Aldridge still made preserves in the autumn, and brought them to the hall because she had decided some years ago that it was simply something she did. People said the simplest version of all the things that needed to be said. "That's the Duchess. She's the one who fixed it." She was. She had walked into a failing estate with an accounts box and a set of conditions and a mind that had never not once accepted the proposition that what it could see and understand was something it should be ashamed of. She had fixed it, not because she was remarkable, not because she was exceptional in ways that set her apart from the world, but because she had refused steadily completely at every point where refusal was required to believe that her intelligence was something to be managed, minimized, or apologized for. That refusal was the thing no one had been able to take from her. It was also, in the end, the thing that built everything else. And Amelia Whitmore, Ravenshire, who had been told at 24 that she was too clever to stay, stood in the spring fields of the estate she had rebuilt with the man who had been wise enough to ask her to, and understood not with drama, not with performance, but with the quiet, absolute certainty of a woman who has done the work and knows what it proves that she had never been too clever for anything. She had simply been too clever for the people who couldn't keep up.